I noticed when the new minis came out.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah. I started noticing a few of the old videos.
Yeah,
they're much smaller than the ones they sell now.
They weigh nothing. 1,400 pounds. But we had a Presbyterian priest who was Scottish who came to this country.
I know, I have a little straight.
And they had the originals had so much storage space, pockets here and there, and stuff under the seats. And he said they would
Technical difficulties, folks.
load up. His wife would load up
Let the
2
web-
kids and the dog.
Webmaster would do his
camping.
Can't do that with the new. Well, you could if it was 2 people.
She's actually had one of those.
No, the new one, right?
No, we can't even get that. You're right.
Yeah, you can always tell.
This is a sign.
Everybody got their own style.
Okay, I never noticed. I'm not so mechanic.
Well, he liked the our older kids to work on this one. Not so much.
Just like
Yeah, the old cars you could, my level of expertise, you could at least change the oil, but not anymore.
Yeah, I can go on this
But in
one.
order, I don't think I have to do anymore. If you wanted a 1x2, which we're talking about letters, you had to be the highest class you could. Now I don't think that matters anymore as long as it's not getting possible, just like a vanity plate.
I mean, without a lot of effort.
Car, as long as it's not used, it's not.
It's the turbo interview.
And there's such a variety here.
Yes, there is the call district areas. So when I see somebody with the W3, K3, W3, W83, call district 3 includes Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., Maryland, there's Texas, California, call for 6. Someone in California, so you know immediately. But again, when you work outside your call district, you say either mobile or fixed stations. Like say this spouse from California doesn't use if I was in California, CW.
Ah, yes, we can talk about it.
Sarcastic comment.
What's that?
You're sarcastic.
Please, how am I here to stay home if I didn't?
Yes. I hope everybody has been to see the gentleman at the end of the hall too.
There's 6 of us, and we're talking each one individually.
What's covered?
Who's covered?
Covered? Good, okay. Well, somebody asked me to remind people, apparently it all been done.
And also, don't forget to turn in your magnetic badge and keys.
Yes.
When you leave, there's a box in the lobby of the main building.
Yes, they don't like it when you have to mail them back. I can tell you from experience.
Yeah, don't do that.
In the program is in the visitor center? Is that?
There's a box, steps,
Right at the steps,
keep
right
your
behind the
box
steps.
on the right.
Went up to the Drake room.
2 people were talking with you. What is it?
Let's wait
When
by
you
the
walk
office.
into the lobby, it's the end of
Just as you're going up the
I
steps.
thought it was right there by the office.
Okay.
It's by that wall.
Yes.
The end of it.
Right there, there's a box.
Okay.
Okay, well, we're ready to start. And Mr. Osborne, talk about RSC.
All right, Adrian asked me to do a little bit of a retrospective on some of the things Sarah's done, and I thought this was one of the better ones. If you get a chance, go to Arecibo, but like most things, getting the inside tour is a lot more difficult. So if you know the magic words, though, things like jet ski and DB, and get an engineer engaged, then that's a big difference because they'll pull you into, they finally found somebody that can appreciate what they do. And so like, we got lucky. In this case, one of the people that was running the dish at Arecibo wanted to see the observatory that I was working at the time. So we give them a tour. When we went down, they wanted to reciprocate. So I got the better end of that deal. Janice and I got to go up to the feed on Arecibo.
So you guys walk on the catwalk?
We got to go all the way down. We'll show you pictures in here, all the way into the feeds. Okay, Arecibo is very deceptive since it's so gigantic. It's hard to get a scale for the place. You've got 1.5 million pounds suspended above the dish. So you have these enormous towers and anchors going back into the karst to try to anchor the tension on these cables. Let's see, where's the pointer? Here we go. So of course from the movies you've seen all the perspectives kind of like this. And this is the catwalk, and there's a lot better pictures in the presentation here of that. So we've got a 1,000-foot diameter spherical dish. Now it actually doesn't use a full 1,000 feet because to be able to point, they actually focus in on a smaller area of the dish, and then that moves around on the surface. That point only uses a portion. And so along the edge, we've got this screen. They put that up, I don't know, 20 years ago to try to improve the noise temperature of the dish. They could bring that beam off to the side, but as soon as they spilled over into the foliage, then the noise temperature came up. So they added 80 feet more screening out in here so that they could bring that beam on up and it would still just be seeing cold sky. That was the motivation behind it. So they're able to point plus minus 20 degrees from zenith. And that's pretty limiting, but they get to do a lot of galactic work. And of course, planetary radar is very important in this operation. And of course, Patrick helped a lot on clarifying some of the points in the presentation a couple of days ago. Okay, now he had some good pictures of the line feed. This is before it broke. So that line feed is a very efficient antenna in order to illuminate the full dish, or at least the large section of it that they're pointing at. But unfortunately, since it broke off right about here, that is now out of commission. So they're having to do their operations through the Gregorian dome. And so that kind of limits things a little bit. Because it's much easier to put a couple million watts through a giant waveguide than to try to fold it down into this small feed. All right, and this shows a picture, thanks Christian Monstein for a picture that's more recent where we show the broken feed versus, this is one of my pictures where I tried to show where the feed broke at. So that fell through the dish. I think they said it damaged about 30 panels. So not a significant amount of damage to the surface, but getting that feed replaced will be a couple of $1 million. So they're still trying to get funding for that. And I think Patrick Taylor the other day mentioned that there was some funding in the Maria recovery that might go to that. So far, they haven't gotten a lot of those funds. Okay, this is a view from the end of the catwalk. And so there's the walkway, which gets fairly steep out near the end, as far as climbing up it. And let's see, I'm right here, and our guide's right there. And Janice is taking the pictures, so I have to give her credit. She was doing a lot of these pictures. If I'm in it, actually, she's the one that's taking it. Now, the interesting part of this is there's more than one way to get up to the feed. The control room is down here. The office building is right here, where the scientists have their offices. And there's a little building right there. It doesn't get shown up very much in the pictures we take. That has a cable car that's made out of wire. So it's like a chain link basket that's big enough for 3 people to get in, very close to each other. So it's really just a man lift kind of thing. And of course, you're 500 feet above the dish at this point by the time you get up to the structure. So they wanted to take us up via the basket winch. So we'll do that. And you can kind of see here, there's a good segment. There's the basket going up. It's teeny tiny. So on Aerial America, look for the segment on Puerto Rico. And it has a pretty good few minutes on the Arecibo. And so they had done the basket way up to the feed themselves for that segment. And it's got a lot of good angles and things. I think they do a lot of that with drones where they're flying around with quadcopters and stuff. And so they get some good pictures you could not get any other way. Okay, there's another shot of the basket. And you can kind of see how big a person is in that. So we're going up, from the little motor room that actually makes the cable car go. And the guide that was taking us up to the feed, he says, now once I hit this button, it can't stop. There's no control from the basket. There's a kill switch or an end of travel switch up on the structure and at this end. So once it starts, it starts. So if you're going to have, if you're queasy about heights, let me know now before I hit this button. So we got up about halfway, and Janice comes up with the best comment. She says, I bet some people have a real problem with this. Okay, and this is a good shot, good high resolution shot of the surface. You can see the panels, each individual 38,778 panels, 40 by 80 inches. So they're, bigger than a table, but still very small in this picture. So when they're working up on the feed, naturally, if you drop a wrench 500 feet, the panels get totaled. So there's a boneyard of panels that are all bashed in from dropping small objects down on them. Okay, and that's a good shot of the fence, where it's a slightly different angle than the dish, so that you're not looking at the same object, with the reflection or anything. So it does a good job of improving the signal to noise out at the extremes. There's Janice. So we're up on the catwalk getting ready to go out into the center pivot point. Here's the 432 megahertz waveguide. I mean, it's like air conditioning duct size. So very challenging thing to get that size waveguide into a flexible format so that you can do it's a lot like an IGUS chain, if anybody knows what that is, in machines where you have to double back on yourself. So they're able to move across that segment, that arc, and still feed the megawatt power out to the transmitter antenna. And that's a better shot of the line feed. Now, one thing we didn't, that we noticed while we were there are some Yagis under the little carriage house, sort of at the base of this 432 antenna. And they're somewhere in the frequency range of 54 to 67 megahertz. So there's several of those that are there. I think they got messed up pretty good in the hurricane too. And I remember they also mentioned that there was a SETI feed out there. So on the bottom of this little building, and this is 15 years ago, so this 2004 time frame, they had managed to get a feed out there that would just take the random pointing of whatever observer was doing, observing, and then feed that into the SETI back in. So that was going on pretty much continuously at that time. Any questions on any of this so far? Okay, and this is going down through the platform walkways. That's the stairs, and of course it's chain link. So you really have to watch what you're doing or what you're carrying up there, because it would be very easy to just drop your keys or something out of your pocket down to the dish. So they make a lot of comments about that. And the hard hats. I don't know how many hard hats they've lost by people just looking over and have it fall off their head, but I can see that happening. Okay, so there's the center pivot. And Patrick was talking about getting rid of the heat from the radar, the klystrons. So there is a klystron inside of the Gregorian dome. And these are the fans that he was talking about that they had to put on there to get rid of that million watts of excess waste heat. So that's big. I mean, the dome is 85 feet or a little bit more tall, 180,000 pounds suspended from the tag points here. So that was a big addition to the weight on the feed structure when that was lifted into place. And this is a good ray diagram of how they're actually doing the collapsing the line focus of the spherical shape into a point. So these aren't parabolas. They're a complex kind of a helmet-looking shape. It's not quite as exaggerated maybe as this picture, but you can kind of see how they would bring all that to a pretty tight point. So it's like contacts or something. It's a way of focusing that energy together. And the dome, of course, I mentioned it's an 85-foot subreflector. So there's an 85-foot dish hidden inside that dome looking down, and then a 15-foot dish looking up to the bottom of the carousel where the feeds are. Okay, this is a shot from underneath, carousel. So since they've got that double optics reflection, unlike the GBT, their carousel is looking down. So these are the feeds on the carousel. Now, this was the first time that I had ever seen a feed that needed water cooling. So there's so much power going through there. Normally, there's a part of the losses in a feed that are attributed to ohmic losses, surface conductivity, and usually it's kind of a few percent of the antenna noise temperature, so it's almost negligible. But when you're pumping 1,000,000 watts through it, 1,000,000 watts, even if it's 0.05 dB loss or something, becomes a lot of heat. So that feed is pretty substantial.
Charles, if you got a scratch or something in the inner surface of that feed, would you get arcing at the scratch?
I don't know that you would get arcing, but you might cause something in terms of excess heating.
If something bad would happen at the scratch, I got a feeling at that power level.
Yeah, I can't imagine a bug surviving. So, yeah, it would be like a bug zapper problem.
Self-cleaning.
Even roaches wouldn't survive that.
So a lot of these feeds on the receive end, of course, can see some spillover, and they have to be protected. Even though the waveguide is beyond cutoff, or there's some filtering there, that much power is going to have a bad effect on other low noise amplifiers that are hooked up. So in this picture, only a few feeds had the covers that were able to be articulated to go in front of the feed. And in Patrick's presentation the other day, I noticed there were more. So they had tried to cover everything. So there's a lot of effort to make a really good seal with a microwave absorber over the feed throat for any of the unused bandages.
Now, when they're doing it as a transmit receive operation radar, what's their TR switch look like?
I'm not even sure. I don't think
Because somehow they're going to receive that same frequency with the same antenna.
Yeah.
That kind of implies a giant relay in some kind.
I think he said they shift speed.
Well, remember, they also, if they're doing planetary radar, they transmit for like 30 minutes and then switch over to receive. So the first signal at the beginning of the transmissions hit the object and then come back, it takes minutes. But if you're doing the ionosphere, yeah, there needs to be a fast TR. Did he mention how fast that was? I can't remember.
He said it took 8 seconds to switch.
Yeah, I think that was a mechanical. Okay, that was
the shifting of the feeds.
But to do the ionosphere, I think they have to do something else that's much quicker, because you've got to be transitioning in nanoseconds.
I thought that most of their radar work was done with the receiver here.
No, there's a way of doing it from there, totally. But it is better, because from here, if Arecibo runs out of travel and the signal's still traveling for 30 minutes, GBT could then receive even after it's set on the dish at Arecibo. So there's a lot of advantages, plus the isolation issue, not having to come out of the megawatt stage and go into the low noise. Let's see, here's one that you might be interested in. This is the 327 feet. So it's cross dipoles. They call these things cavity-backed cross dipole feeds. Kind of interesting design with a lot of capacitive plates around it. So it normally will a lot of the ones I see here are like a tub, but in this case, it's kind of open structure. So this ring out here on the end is sort of helping define that outer shroud portion. Okay, and that's a look from inside the feed dome down into the 15-foot tertiary reflector. So that one's looking up. Okay, here's some of the transmit assembly. You notice this absorber here on the wall. Usually the black tip absorber is because it's high enough power that you might catch the tips on fire. So this is the low power stuff, and this is a lot less common. So it's a little harder ceramic type tips. Usually the tips will burn first before you get enough power to burn further down. So I'm just thinking there must be some waveguide leaks right in here. They may be small, but if they got a megawatt on the other side of them, it can amount to quite a bit. So that's kind of new addition there. And also this is wrapped in radar absorbing material. So those are sheets of carbon loaded foam, kind of silicon. Sometimes it's silicon rubber with some absorber in it, and other times it's kind of like couch foam, actually, the polyurethane type stuff. That's what these things are. They're just loaded with carbon. And over a period of time, this stuff sort of deteriorates, and the foam becomes a little crumbly. So it can be kind of messy. You touch it, you get black carbon on you. And so anyway, they're obviously fixing RF leaks here to try to help the other equipment in the room not get overloaded with stray RF. And I think that's orthomode transducer. So that's probably the vertical or the two polarizations being separated out for this feed. All right, and a lot of things in that room, of course, are cryogenically cooled. It's a lot like a GBT. You constantly hear the pocket-a, high-pitched noise of those compressed helium compressors going. And that cable wrap is carrying the high and low pressure lines into those feeds while they're able to rotate. And there's one of the cold fingers, they call it, pulled out of the system. So when you're up in the GBT feed room, you can see the little piston going around through the window. It's in the end of this. The piston goes down through this portion here, and it's going in and out of some tight apertures in there. So usually these things have two stages of cooling. So you've got a tip that is as cold as it can get, which will be 4.7 Kelvin, something like that physical temperature. And then usually there's another level that might be 77, so it doesn't have quite as much contact with the cold portion. And they can only pull a few watts of heat out of things. So all these are sticking into vacuum dewars that are high vacuum chambers. If it wasn't for that, the electronics would be picking up frost out of the air. So everything that's going to be cooled below the dew point has to have a vacuum around it to make sure there's no water in there to damage the circuit.
Right. Even nitrogen would turn into frost at that temperature,
Yes.
wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, so it has to be vacuumed down before they start cooling, and sometimes you'll actually bring that section back up to temperature to try to boil that off again and then vacuum it down. So you're trying to scavenge all the atoms out. I mean, this is actually a way of improving the vacuum. When what few atoms are left in the vacuum chamber collects on something that's really cold, then it's no longer bouncing around and carrying heat from one place to another. All right, and this is the alpha, the multi-pixel L-band feed array. I'll show you some more pictures of that. They gave us a real good presentation on that while the SARA Conference was going on. Steve Torchinsky, the chief engineer of the electronics group, was in charge of having that installed, I think, the previous year. And so there was some good picturing. Just by touching something with a copper strap, you can cool it down because there's not a lot of heat loss in that strap. That ribbon can bring that heat out and into the cold portion through simple straps. And like right here, you can see the cold finger. So that's the very end, touching another plate, and then bringing that cold up to one of the low noise amplifier stations. So it's an interesting thermodynamics model, I'm sure, how they move the heat around to keep from overwhelming the cooler. Okay, and this was a nice graphic of the feed pattern. You're kind of fighting two things here. You're dealing with feed cross-coupling. So there's some interaction between the adjacent feeds since they're on the same frequency. And so you're making a multi-pixel camera at L-band, and you're spacing them as close as you can without the proximity causing the pattern to get disrupted too much. Okay. And you kind of see the stepped feeds there as they go down through different sizes of corrugations to match the pattern that they're looking for, get enough gain to illuminate the dish properly. Okay, and this is probably, I don't know if you can read it in the proceedings, but probably on the memory stick there may be the slides, I think, are on there, and you can see this block diagram. So this is not that uncommon for any of the systems here either. It shows the calibration system they've got in place to inject noise. You've got the low noise amps. You've got the transition to fiber, and then it comes down off the feed and down to the back end area over fiber. So this is kind of a typical sort of a block diagram for anything here too, but it is a good thing to look at because it's got a lot of the system engineering numbers on it, showing what the losses and levels are in gains. And got a little bit of filtering here and there. There's a mix to down convert it. And once it gets to the control room, then it gets split out into a lot of different areas, test ports, and multiple receivers doing different things. So by the time you get down to this portion, you're allowing whoever could use that signal to process it in their particular manner, yet you're isolating it from the adjacent investigator. So they might be doing pulsar processing with this one. Here we've got some FPGAs digitizing the signal. And this is a kind of breaking out the signal to look at the monitor path. And some noise injection on that side. Any questions on that? And a lot of this stuff you can find online too. I would mention there's some good, if you get into the engineering section of here or Arecibo, a lot of the observatories have some pretty open things like this that show how the system works. So it's a good thing to look through and gradually understand the process, because it applies to us too, just at a different scale. Okay, new feeds and projects. They've got another one called Alpaca that's coming up. They got funded $5.8 million last August, and this was billed as being a 500% increase in observing capability. So this receiver uses 166 antennas to create 40 beams. And it's kind of a project by University of Central Florida, which has become taken over some of the management contract for Arecibo, which was for a long time Cornell. So I don't completely understand all that. I wanted to actually get into that with Patrick, but didn't get a chance. So that's kind of a change in their funding stream and how the projects are managed. So I don't know exactly how that works, but it's also kind of like here at Green Bank, NRAO and GBO and NSF, and how all that money flows and gets directed. And also, I noticed yesterday, Mike Holstein mentioned nanograph. So apparently that's also targeted to use Arecibo. So that's another observatory doing gravitational waves using pulsars. I don't fully understand that one, but I did find that as a recent addition to the projects list. And then Galactic Arecibo L-band feed array, I think that's just an upgrade to the earlier alpha. So there's several projects like that that I could see on looking around at some of the Arecibo funding. And so it's kind of interesting to watch, how the website changes over time, how they're presenting things. So the hurricane was really kind of a devastating thing, but yet the observatory had generators and was much more prepared for power outages and things of that sort. So they did become kind of like a site where helicopters could come in, use their helipad, and distribute relief efforts out. So they were very central to what was going on there. And of course, Patrick mentioned Angel Vasquez. So he's one of the hams on the site and got a big award for what he did. So. Okay, that's just a quick look at the surface data. So we've got a 1,000-foot dish, which is 20 acres of observing capture area. So that really dominates a link budget when you're talking about how many, watts per square meter can you capture. This is the big aperture. And I've got a slide updated here to try to show how fast the Chinese dish compares. It's hard to find all the information on that so far, but it's a very different dish. Okay. And they did have a 5 and 8 megahertz cross dipole array added. So there is a transmit capability there at 5 and 8 megahertz. I forget the total power. I mean, it's not outrageous, but it is high. They're trying to do ionospheric heating. And so they actually are heating a spot on the ionosphere and then looking at it at other frequencies to see what the effect is. And I don't know how much that got damaged, but obviously if the line feed fell, it fell right where that dipole array was.
I was there in December. There was a lot of panels missing in the center, and you could see 3 of the 4 dipoles.
So there was only one got hit then?
I think only one got hit.
Okay. How's that for a turnbuckle? Yeah. So that's a cable tensioner for the catenary cable that goes under that supports those panels under the surface. So it's bigger than I am, turnbuckle. And this, of course, is underneath, so you've got a lot of smaller cables going to concrete pads down under there to try to make fine adjustments to make the surface good enough to work at 10 gigahertz.
How do they handle seismic problems? I mean, an undetectable to a people earthquake could shift that whole thing enough, it seems to make a real problem.
That I haven't gotten an answer on, but that's a good question. I wondered too, because they're very close to a seismic rift down there. And usually when you look at the USGS earthquake maps, there's a cluster of things happening off Puerto Rico's coast. So they probably do get frequent earthquakes. Probably like anything else, you just have to deal with it. But it's not serious enough, apparently, to damage anything at this point.
As a result in losing a day for everybody adjusting all the turnbuckles to get the dish straighter.
I guess nothing's permanent, so maybe the jiggles just damp out over a period of time. Some of the bigger earthquakes could show vibrations for up to 2 hours after the quake that are measurable, but I don't know how much that would actually impact what's going on here. It's probably another channel in the data that they captured. So if somebody saw an oddity in their 10 gigahertz measurement, maybe they'd check the seismometer record and see if there was something that would have caused the surface to wiggle. Anyway, these are impressive gain numbers. The planetary radar, let's see, I think I worked this one out. If you take the power and gain involved here, you're looking at 20 terawatts EIRP. So effective isotropic radiated power of 20 terawatts. And I've heard a couple of times it mentioned that this is the strongest signal that Earth radiates. So none of the other radars plus their gain come anywhere close to this. So that would be observable from the longest distance.
Is there a no-fly zone over that to keep airplanes from being cooked?
Probably, but I don't know for sure. It would be wise. Yeah, if you were, that would certainly ping the old transponder pretty good.
Fly-by-wire airplanes, you know, when the wire burns out.
Okay, let's see, any questions on that? Okay, this is some of the back-end electronics. Just got racks and racks, it's kind of like here, of IF processing equipment. You go from fiber to RF at a common frequency, and then into the processing back ends to be digitized And a lot of times they will have a particular observer come in with their own equipment and their own computers and set up racks behind this and log data with their own FPGA processors and things. So this is kind of the common test equipment area here. Now, when SARA was there, they actually let us use the dish. So we had access to this room, and one of the other pictures here, I'll show Peter Eibling's in 4IP actually plugged in his SDR into the dish. And so he could look at all that and find a monitor port and hook up to it at the IF and get his laptop there and take a look. So I don't know what he saw or if he was just doing it to say that he had, had put it on Arecibo. But there was an easy way to hook that up on just one of the monitor boards. Okay, this is some of the, like I was saying, another observing method. So doing pulsars, a number of groups have built pulsar back ends and brought them to Arecibo. So this one was from Princeton, and not too much more I can say about that. It's Ask Joe Taylor. You may know. By the way, if you go on their site, on Arecibo's website, you can take a look at the observing schedule. So that was a question, I think, the other day. I wish I'd printed it out because it does show the different bands and who the observers are. So there's this long list of principal investigators, and then their initials are on the various time slots. So if you click on the matrix of bands and times that are active, you'll actually bring up an observing request, and it'll give you a paragraph that says what they wanted to see. So that's kind of interesting to do, and who the observers are. Okay, there's the 432 megahertz radar control panel. Normally, you might see small pots to adjust things. In this case, over to the side here, these are rheostats. So giant variacs. So much larger scale of adjustment on that klystron.
What kind of voltages are they running on that klystron? Is it an X-ray hazard because of the high voltages?
I think there were labels to that effect, yeah. And any of those things where you got that kind of acceleration voltage, if it hits metal, it's going to generate X-rays. And there's cameras a little bit, things like that. So they're pretty picky about that up in the dome. But they did make a comment that by the time the megawatt spreads to the surface, you're down to the 110 milliwatt per square centimeter safety limit. So you could probably walk around on the surface and survive. Wouldn't be recommended as a long-term thing. But it is interesting that you can be dangerous at the feed and somewhat survivable by the time you get to the surface because it's spread that much, square law spreading. Okay, and that's Peter that I was mentioning, hooked into the back end, and Robin Cutshaw, AA4RC.
Hey, Charles.
Yeah.
If power density is so low across so much area, you probably are safe flying over it. That's your beam, that's your best case beam.
Yeah, probably, but.
Wouldn't recommend it, but.
Yeah.
You first.
Yeah.
What do I do? Up higher, a little bit.
Okay, there's the control position. So they've got kind of a graphic that shows the position of that triangle up on the feed. So you know if you're about to run out of space or how far it is to rotate it around to do another observation. And then they've got the back-end selection areas. You've got a lot sitting there on different screens, different computers that you can bring up to control the observation that you're doing.
And you never change that shirt.
I think that might come up. It is a different one. I'm a few sizes larger now. Same pattern, a little different color. Yeah. Yeah, that was 15 years ago. I think I was a bit lighter then.
But you made it up with your hair, right?
Yeah. Yeah, see, I had a little more hair. Didn't completely irradiate me. Okay, this is the how many backseat drivers can you stand picture. So John,
Karen.
yeah, Karen Jensen, John Manone, and so they were running the observation, and everybody else is behind them coaching, waiting their chance to do an observation.
Those are all SARA people?
Yes. All, yeah, almost. I think they all are. Maybe not her. And this guy maybe. I think they might have been staff folks. Wanda here, Wanda Diaz, she spoke at the SARA Conference years ago. And she was getting her PhD. She subsequently went blind. So during the time when she was getting her PhD, she lost her vision. So I saw her on PBS here recently doing a presentation on sonification. So she's got some notoriety as the blind astronomer. So she works in, I think, Hartbeespoort, South Africa, at the Observatory. And she's doing a lot of visualization techniques for blind people to be able to visualize the graphics that we take for granted. Okay, this lady was her advisor. This is Carmen Pantoya. She also came to Green Bank. So Carmen was instrumental in getting the SARA meeting there and setting all this up. So Wanda and Carmen really did a bang-up job getting us, for the first time, to ever go down there and have a conference. So we were really lucky, especially to get observing time. That's just unheard of, to just walk in and be taught how to use the dish and then actually get to do some observations. Okay, got David Fields, Mike Howell, and let's see, this is Steve Torchinsky that I mentioned that was doing the Alpha project feed. So they were speakers at the conference there. So the visitor center had a nice room that would accommodate maybe 30 people. So it was much smaller than this, but we had a real good short conference there. And I think it all came together very quickly. So as I remember, we were organizing this and deciding to go sort of at the last minute. So we're lucky it was, you didn't have to have visas and all kinds of things like that at the time. And so it's much easier to just pick up and attend. So in fact, a few of the people that were in those pictures, I think, joined to get to go to that meeting. So it was like a last minute thing. So we had maybe 20 people there.
What year was it again?
2004 in the fall. And of course, these are some pictures from back then. So, let's see, I think Christian Monstein was telling me this restaurant is no more. So I don't know if hurricane got it or if it just sort of deteriorated, but he said it was just a crumbling mess. This is the restaurant El Observatory. So we were eating there during the conference. Now on site at the observatory, of course we've got visiting scientist quarters. It's like a little motel. And then you got the Jodie Foster type little huts kind of thing. I think Christian mentioned he stayed in the one that Jodie Foster was in contact in. So he had a lot of fun doing that. So they do have some on-site accommodations, and they also have a cafeteria for staff. So we got to eat at their cafeteria, and it was kind of like here. You got a real mix of people, and everybody's willing to answer questions and things like that. Okay, this was some of the traveling around the island Janice and I did before. A lot of the housing there is concrete. In other words, if you got the money, you make it out of concrete because you got termites, hurricanes, and so there were a lot of houses that were built like this one here or this one. See, that looks pretty substantial. So they get hit pretty hard, and if you don't have the money to build a house like that, it doesn't end well. So there's a lot of damage there, and it still hasn't gotten rebuilt. So definitely, in fact, I was looking at the logs for the observatory, and they were still showing power outages. So they do have the generators to keep themselves going. But there was like a 2-hour power outage in one night that I was looking at the list of who was observing. So they go to the generator and then switch back. Okay. This is just kind of this is not an untypical road. No lines, pretty narrow, grass growing up in the middle, even cracks. You don't go very fast. You be real careful because there could be a horse in the road, or no telling what kind of obstacle or the road might have washed away. So,
Or a frog blocking traffic.
yeah, this is a coat line. They're tiny little frogs, but they got a big voice.
You'll hear them.
Yeah, they really give you that feel that you're in a rainforest. So it's kind of neat. They're everywhere. Okay, and that was the group there, the SARA group eating at the restaurant for our group photo. Okay, I'll say a few words about FAST. I figured that question would come up. How does FAST compare? Okay, it's 3 times Arecibo's surface area. So 500-meter dish, 3 times Arecibo's pointing range. But it's kind of interesting, the description that I saw says that they're deforming the surface so that it's not spherical. So they're deforming it into a parabola, and all these actuators are under the surface, and they're actually, as the portion of the dish that they're using moves around, they're deforming different parts of the dish with actuators underneath. So that sounds really challenging. The panels are much bigger. They've got 2,250 articulated joints that they're pulling. So kind of like the corners of the GBT panels, only instead of being a 40 by 60 inch panel, it's a 36-foot triangular panel. So in the pictures that doesn't really come across as much, but it sounds like it would have a more coarse surface doing it that way. So I don't know at this point what their success is in getting deforming to a parabola and what frequency they can hold that accuracy at. They're bragging about being able to move the focus around by cables. So there's 6 towers surrounding it and a cable coming from each tower to the feed box. And so the box itself is only 30 tons. Only 30 tons. But it's a room with the feeds and not normally occupied, I guess. But that little box gets hoisted up and moved around until it's in the right spot by the tension on the cables. So that's very different than air SIBO. So that is able to position that feed box within 1 centimeter of where they want it to be. I mean, that's their target apparently. And I know that they have quiet zone. In China, it's much easier to enforce the quiet zone, right? So they just cleared out a large area of all the residents, and that became fast telescopes, equivalent to the close-in quiet zone here. Dennis?
Do we know if they're doing any transmitting?
I don't think they are. As far as I know, they don't have that capability. And part of the reason is how much power can you feed out on these little cables? I mean, they're big enough to lift a 30-ton feed room, but it looked a little challenging. So there was enough power in there to run the various receivers and then keep everything cool and stuff like that. But it's a much smaller thing than, say, the feed on the GBT, and dramatically smaller than air SIBO's approach with, 1.5 million pounds of feed supported out there. And I don't think they have any taglines that come down to help make that stay put. So the only way you keep that box put is make the cables tighter. So you're pulling that, and of course you get a lot of wind. Looks like it would go up and down, things like that. Air SIBO has cables that come from the triangle straight down through the dish to hook it to the ground. So they damp out a lot of the weird modes that you might get with winds by having pull points in different spots. So air SIBO is probably really solid, and I don't know about fast, but it'll be interesting to see the data. Okay, first light was July 2016. Okay, any questions?
Any significant results from FAST? Are they getting good science?
I haven't seen anything, so I don't know. Has anybody seen anything from FAST? 3 years, I guess they've been going, so they don't share well.
You think they'd want to brag?
Yeah, you would think.
Yeah.
So can I say one thing over there? If anyone would like another hard copy of the proceedings, they're sitting on the desk. I'm getting ready to load them. That's it. When they're gone, they're $20, okay? And if you order them online afterwards, you probably won't get a hard copy because we're just not mailing that stuff anymore. So that's a perk of coming here, getting the hard copy. The rest of them probably go in the trash. shirts are packed, they're no longer available, I'm not taking them out of the car again. Take them off, I've met my sales quota for the week, I think I sold 11. One fellow bought 3 there, so that's a good thing. Again, we're always looking for ways to improve the registration process, the paying process, the room process. So anybody that has any ideas, feel free to send me an email. Thank you all very much.
Okay, guys, let's come back at 10:25, and I'll have Jay Woodson talking about astronomy for visually impaired.
I know. Do what?
Oh, yeah. So you're gonna sign up then too, right? You mean on our account? I'm saying until you really know what you're doing, you don't need a lot of talk. I was invested for years. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how good they are, but they do look impressive. I need to do 1 second, so I think the faults more like, you put in one, but sometimes it just stands out. 10, I'm not sure how that works, but I think, yeah, if you put in 1, you may only try it for a second. When you look at the page, it's like 10 seconds. Yeah, just encourage it, but then once you kind of say, oh, this is bad. All right,
Yeah. You don't have to tell that.
yeah, that's all I saw. I was just not wasting stuff. I mean, I have nothing else left. I'll do 1 second. I need a little more time to test what I want. I like picture stars. Get that was fun. That's all I can do. Everything was erratic.
Too much trouble keeping it clean.
Keep it cold.
All right, well, have a good drive back.
Yeah, Carrie's gonna drive us.
What was it, 5 hours?
Yeah.
You said?
expect to have additional stuff that I brought with me. If there's anybody who wants to see pictures or the map of the Little Bighorn, I brought some stuff with me. I know you took some people
Yeah.
there last night, so.
It was very light, because they had cleared out a lot of clutter. The stairs were dead. We probably messed up a couple of years ago, because I was trying to clear it out. I already bought clippers with me, and they were all that stuff was cleared out. So, yeah, there is, probably speaking in term, but we're going to see if I can work with them on that, how,
Good idea.
but it's, even if they used it for scientific stuff, because it's only going to kind of sit there and aim in one direction, all we have to do is split the signal out and use one side of the signal for education for us. So, but none of that's been discussed. It's all pie in the sky right now. Somebody's got to come up with some money for wood to hold that phony dog up. It's in pretty bad shape. It is a lot more rotten than I thought. I didn't want to get close to it last time. This time I can see, because they've got a lot of brush cleared out. So, but the big picture's pretty decent. The roof's not leaking too bad. The floor is kind of cracked. Stuff, so there's a soft spot right over there. It's going to take a little bit. It's going to take wood.
Well, in the overall scheme of things, wood is cheap.
Well, even that big wood, I believe you could drop 20 on that, which we don't have, throw away. You could drop about 20K there. So it could be close to mine. There's a lot of small stuff.
Right, it's got to be.
So if he does his, I want to do concrete thing, but he's going to have to restore it. There's no wood, the old stuff. I mean, the stuff, the real front's not too bad, but the stuff down toward the middle is, you know, but I was kind of glad that, you know, it was discussion. I was able to have a discussion with him like 2 years ago, but I was glad that we had it for years.
Ready? I think so. You're going to check the cell down there. I think it's probably. Connect this to
Somebody does the schedule here. Jay, I'm gonna tell you,
Sure.
when I do my little, I'm gonna do a little 30-picture thing of going to Western Conference. If I mispronounce, I need to add something, just jump right in. I mean, I'm gonna basically cover car, conference, pictures, Will Thompson.
Yes.
So,
You too, and state election.
Yeah.
so it's just sending me all possible, so that's what I'm trying to do.
Yes, I will do that.
Not discounting any of them.
Probably next time we see each other down in Washington again. Someday that's gonna happen. I think
I'll still.
continue to be I definitely need
You'll get your,
need to get to that.
you'll get your iron.
But take care.
You do.
Okay, you too, thanks.
Yeah.
Adrian, it's
Appreciate
great.
your time.
Yep, it was,
We will talk.
we will talk, and it was a lot of fun.
We'll talk. And you're where now? What state?
I'm in Pennsylvania.
You're in Southeast?
Southeast, that is correct.
Okay.
Yep. I forget the first name.
Oh, Steve.
Steve, okay, Dr. Steve, good seeing you and meeting you. And
Joyce.
Joyce, okay, safe journeys back to.
Yeah.
I hope you're gonna be here next year.
Everybody has been talking to me.
Lord willing. All right.
And let's see, next year is the Gibbs year.
Yes. Yes.
South Central Task Force, South Central
No.
You're contributing, you're asking questions?
No.
I worked with them.
Yeah.
Do you really? Yeah, my ham, especially ham. Even, I jump on 2 years this morning.
Emergency.
Yes. Yes. All right.
Okay, have a safe trip. Have a good trip. Good day.
All right. Take care and
Stay in touch.
we'll stay in touch.
Yeah.
Story for next year. I know Eric's gonna love this. Yeah. Try to catch up with him.
I guess the system will change.
All right, safe journeys back. Yes, well, he, with it, he has a young family now, and he is heavily involved with his work. So, but he was really fired up when he finally said that, hey, let's walk the dishes. And it's been all year long. And so he kind of got fired up. He's so busy. Yeah. That was a little kid. Yes. And I think he's going to be impressed with that's why, I mean, I knew you guys still remember, but I said the story has to be told because this would have never even started. I would have done my work, but without a 4.5 meter connection. But it's just the beauty of the story, how it all came into existence. All right, take care, Ryan. All right, here's the water. You don't have to worry about being short.
It's also supposed to, no. Everyone ever.
Just don't get too close to the compass.
It's trained on the basics of God. It's just a lot of.
It's a lot of just stuff. Pretty fast.
Iron water. Iron water. Must be good for you.
I must need it.
Yeah, but after you drink the water around here, that's it. Your signal will be upset.
Where the gypsy never heard about.
I'd have probably
This is space-based.
He got as far as first level. Here's the one chicken. This was.
All right, what's Little Thompson?
Observatory in,
I know, but why is the name Little Thompson?
Oh, river, rivers of the town. Yeah, two rivers, Big Thompson and Little Thompson. And the people are so proud of this. Science Foundation created the observatory. That's the Little Thompson Science. I've been arguing for years. Name the place. These are members. This one's even or this is going to be observatory or something like that. And then people find some map. Yes, there's so much passion in this name. It's the name of the school district. It's the name of the library. It's the fire department. The overall and town had been flooded out. It was right on the stamps. And flooded 3 times. Lost just one town. And they were so determined that's where the water was. We're not going to move the town. The railway came. And down under the hill. And they couldn't, the rail engineers, when they were designing the railway, knew that putting the train stop down at the bottom of the hill was not a good idea. Because they never got enough energy to go back up. Yeah. So the railway put this beautiful water station, or coaling station, on top of the hill, 1.6 kilometers from the river.
sneakers on, and I hit one section of sand, and I start sliding, and this is like a two-story drop. He's there.
Falling over would be better.
I'm not saying it's good.
Well, I would love to know this. I mean, so obvious. I remember it started as a display out
Well, I know, you should
I did, but the school is not. They're going to just
It's not whisper thing about this, it's leaching, talking about
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the switching times, but it's
And
very fast.
walked across.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, one day we were there, and it was a hot day.
So, because, that
Right.
point my, signal off.
It would be fast enough.
Exactly, I said, whoa, wait a minute.
That was the last.
Hit like the seconds, okay, do that.
Yeah.
Just call somebody.
Yeah, I was around. Whoa. I guess not. I think I've heard
Well, and the other possibility is, I have to go back and look at the timing. The path, the radio path is a lot longer than the circumference of the Earth because of all the galaxies.
Okay. How much?
And
20%? It's up to a thousand.
Right.
0.15.
But then there's also students really want to protect their destiny. Is the signal going around here more than once? I remember.
It goes well,
Could be maybe,
But it
in
would
the
be.
case it had
the first one is strongest, the second one is, 10%, and the last one is 12%.
So their experiment is coming here again.
Now, when do you should I show up here with
Gentlemen,
the weather slide?
and ladies. Jay is, got a nice presentation. I've looked it over when they sent it in, we printed it, so we'll let you take it away.
And this is an odd topic probably for this group. And I guess before getting started, how many of you have either friends or family members who have serious vision problems? Okay, so I think a lot of people here. So most families have a connection with somebody who has vision difficulties. At one time in this country, we had schools for the blind, and there was a higher percentage of people with blindness out in the public. There got to be a whole culture related to the teaching of blind people. There got to be a politically correct terminology 10 or 15 years ago as to how people with vision impairments would be referred to. So I'm not going to try to deal with any of that. What we're actually going to be talking about is communicating with people whose vision impairment is so severe that they can't read PowerPoint slides. They can't access chart recorder readings in the way that somebody with normal vision could. And let me explain how our observatory got into the business of trying to do outreach to blind folks. Sort of an interesting story. Over a 20-year period of time, we had had about 75,000 visitors come to the observatory. And as near as we can tell, talking with the volunteers who staffed it, not one blind person had ever visited the observatory. And that's understandable. I mean, why would somebody who can't see go to an optical observatory? The very month we started a radio astronomy program in about 2012 or 2013, that very month we started being contacted by folks saying, my brother-in-law has no sight. Do you have anything there in your radio program that might be of interest to him? People would bring blind children in. The word spread to the blind and vision impaired community really quickly that there's something to do there. And so we've had some young people without sight who would come sit in the radio room literally for hours listening to meteor reflections. We have a system there very similar to what Chip operates online. And when we're not getting active meteors where we are, we just dial up his live meteor site and let him listen to that. But people would actually sit there for hours and then give us a report on what they heard. They heard things that I didn't hear, that none of us saw showing up on the waterfall. Extreme perception, extremely good analytical abilities of doing comparisons of things just based on sound. So we decided to put a little bit of effort into learning how do you better communicate with blind, and I'll refer to them as blind, not just visually impaired. People who really can't read slides, can't read chart recordings, can't get anything useful from a waterfall. So how do you communicate with them? And I tried doing a lot of research, and then the light came on. Ask them. The next time some people are in here, just tell them, what could we be doing better to help you understand all this? And boy, we got some wonderful feedback. To begin with, all of us make stereotyped decisions about people. And one of the stereotyped thoughts I had was that all blind people read Braille. I found out that's not true. Not a lot of them do. Of about 1.5 million people in this country who are totally blind, a smaller and smaller percentage of people read Braille every year for the very simple reason is, number one, it's fairly hard to learn. But number two, most materials, books and things like that, are now available as audio books. And so why go through the very slow process of reading raised print when you can simply listen to it? So we had invested in a Brailling machine. Now, everything related to dealing with blind people is expensive. A Brailling machine, even the cheap ones, will go for around $10,000 new. Maybe they're a little bit less now because they are coming from China. But they're expensive, very, very expensive. We managed to get a used one from the community college at a fairly good price. But after making that investment and before asking our blind visitors what we really need, we were producing Braille materials that meant nothing to the audience. You know, maybe one person in 10 would make something up. But what does benefit them, according to what they tell us, is audio and tactile things. And I've got a few examples of the tactile things that we came up with following a lecture. We had a lecture on New Horizons, and we had a couple of blind folks in the audience who had an awful lot of questions. The New Horizons, of course, took photographs of this very, very strange object, got nicknamed Ultima Thule, but very strange object that it's difficult to describe in words what this thing is. And so our two blind members in the audience had absolutely no idea what the scientist who was talking about New Horizons described. So I went out to our parking lot and found a couple of stones that could be glued together in approximately the shape of this very, very unusual object. At the same time, we had that odd extra solar system visitor come through, did the same thing. Went out and found actually a piece of bark around a tree that when we're discussing this with somebody who cannot see, you'd have to describe, of course, it would be, the relative weight would be a lot heavier. This is just a piece of wood, but this is sort of the shape the thing is in, and that's very unusual. So I just passed those around, nothing really exotic, but if you had access to a 3D printer, for instance, you make very, very realistic models. It would be of help to people. Oh, and there is an actual meteorite in there. It's not a simulation, it's an actual meteorite. So that as people have listened to the meteor sounds, we can let them see feel exactly what the rock is like. So those things seem to be fairly effective.
You can actually download like the New Horizons spacecraft and pre-3D print that.
Oh, wonderful, yeah.
And it's about maybe, so they can actually feel what it looks like.
There's a model as well of Ultima Thule out there.
Yeah.
I was figuring there was.
Yeah, we would have been better off. And the reason I'm sharing all this with you is in case you're trying to do anything in your communities, kind of learn from our mistakes. We would have been much better off instead of buying a brailling machine to get a 3D printer. It would have been cheaper. We could have done much better stuff with it. And in fact, you can print braille. If that's what you want to do. So if anybody, by the way, would like to buy a brailling machine, they're very noisy. It sounds like a machine shop that's going on. They're nothing more than a dot matrix printer with really big dots and a powerful motor to punch out paper. So we tried to do a little bit more research on this, and we found that just like Charles mentioned in his presentation, he had an actual photograph of Dr. Wanda Diaz-Merced. She drew a lot of criticism right after receiving a PhD. There were astrophysicists who felt that she was dumbing down the field by depending so much on the audio sounds. There are astrophysicists and radio astronomers who, almost as an article of faith, say, we don't use headphones like Jodie Foster used. That Dr. Ellie Arroway was doing something that no radio astronomer ever does. We don't use headphones, we don't listen to the static, because there's nothing we can glean from that. We need to process the data, we need to convert it into numbers, charts, things like that. And there was some fairly serious criticism when she started popularizing the whole idea of acoustic astronomy. She did a TED Talk in 2016. It's available on YouTube, sort of to refute those criticisms. And most impressive. The title of her talk is Listen to the Stars. And if you haven't encountered that, it's well worth the 17 minutes it takes to listen to the sounds and her interpretation of what she's hearing. Now, as Charles mentioned, she was started having vision problems in undergrad, and I'm not sure if it was about the time she entered graduate school, she became totally blind. And so she was completely dependent on other faculties there. So quite encouraging to me that somebody would have the wherewithal to shift gears and say, I've lost one of the main tools that radio astronomers would use to do the research. What do I have left? And I'll make the most of that. Well, speaking of the movie Contact, there was a blind radio astronomer as a character in that movie, Dr. Kent Clark. When Carl Sagan wrote the book, he modeled that character after a real life person, Dr. Kent Colors. And I think Skip Curley has worked with Kent Colors, and maybe some of you have too. Very well respected radio astronomer and astrophysicist who became blind shortly after birth because of an accident in the hospital in an incubator. But a third astrophysicist, she originally was from Italy. She now works, I think, for Florida International University out of Miami, is Dr. Fiorella Terenzi. And I'll be playing some audio recordings of hers in a few minutes. The interesting thing about her is Time Magazine did an article on her about 2 years ago, and they referred to her as a cross between Carl Sagan and Madonna. Very interesting. She makes no secret of this. She makes about 5 times as much money from selling audio recordings of radio sources in the sky. Makes that much more than she does from her teaching and the book she's written. Sort of interesting, but she's fully sighted. She has no personal vision problems, but she's been inspired by others with vision problems. So I'll be playing some of her recordings here in a few minutes. But before we get into that, just very quickly, a couple more pass-arounds. We got a hold of Yerkes Observatory, figuring they have worked with the Skynet Junior Scholars programs for a long time. And I asked them the question, what do you do, or do you do anything at all for the visually impaired? And they sent me this. They have a machine, and I'm not sure if Yerkes still does this. It was through the university, of course, and with the closure to the observatory, everything is changing. But they have about a $35,000 machine that can do embossing on special rubberized products so that virtually any photograph, any chart recording can be produced as a tactile image. That was a little expensive for us because we're just like you guys. Yes?
Maybe I better hold my mouth until I see what you're about to say.
Okay. That was a little expensive for us. We couldn't afford to produce things like that. But again, a 3D printer could do that just as well. So I looked around and found, this came from NASA, a thermal embossing paper. It costs about $1 a sheet. So you can run this through any printer, inkjet or laserjet. The images that are put on paper in black will thermally emboss. The other colors will not. So that gives you, and that's a perfect example of it there, that gives you the opportunity of spelling out in plain language for the mentor what the image is, technical details so they can be read to the blind person with just enough braille to kind of show them around on the picture.
Now, is that paper a two-part process? You run it through the printer, and then you run it through some other machine that does the thermal transfer?
Yes. So the printer, we all have those, but the heat machine is about $10,000. So what I did in an attempt to work around that is package of the paper. Here is an example of what a toaster oven would do. So about half of the blind folks that I have showed this to, about half of them are able to interpret it perfectly. None of them could read the Braille for a thing, but they could figure out what the chart was. So in talking with one of those people, he said, you know, you're really going to an awful lot of trouble to do that. Why don't you just print your chart and then use Elmer's glue or something to show me what the lines are up there. Just something that would be cheap and quick and easy. So everybody, the sightless people who showed this to everybody, prefers the Elmer's glue version to the $1 a page version because the impression is higher. It's not embossed in any way. So the compromise we have come up with is we're now just by hand going over our lines, our charts, and then printing out a Braille brief explanation of what it is on a separate sheet of paper. We tried doing the Braille on the same page. It was just too confusing to everybody who tried reading it. So this was run through the Brailler. The one thing we learned about it is you can't just take a text file and run it through a Braille. It doesn't work. It's almost traditional Braille. The words need to be separated a whole lot more than just taking a Word file and running it through. There are some translation programs that I mentioned in the paper. And by the way, the paper on this is on your memory stick. It's not published in the proceedings. The paper will give links for anybody who wants to go into this. We'll give links to sources and some pricing of things. But the end result can be extremely good if you get trained in how to do Braille. And we're working with the local college to get a couple of our folks trained in developing Braille documents.
Can you 3D print text?
You could, yeah. Well, it would need to, there are very, very few blind people, as I understand it, who can read text tactily. So the alphabet is just too complicated. So they need something like Braille or a substitute for Braille. Yes?
Two things. One, that what you just said. Years ago, there was a little device you stuck your finger in. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. And they did read text directly. Kind of a slow and painful process.
Yeah, it was. And these days, a much better application is a text-to-speech or a speech-to-text.
Which is what virtually everybody uses.
Yes, that's right.
The point I was going to make before, and I wasn't afraid you were going to say the point, but you didn't. So now I can say it. It is possible to buy so-called CNC machines. X, Y, and Z, but limited Z. And you can literally use them as done to engrave, or, vis-a-vis what you were just saying, something of an Elmer's-like consistency dispenser mounted in place of the engraving tool, the milling tool. It could easily print, raised images on whatever material you want, such as big thought. And the price, again, thanks to the magnificent Chinese, the prices are quite reasonable, and the software to control them is bootlegged along with the machine. So, if you want to do, if you don't want to do the thermally raised image, this is the ideal machine.
Sounds like it would be. I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about that, a little bit about it. And so I would solicit from the rest of you any feedback, suggestions, clues like that, because This is a community of folks who've been largely ignored by our observatories, in many cases even by community science centers, simply because they haven't come to us. And what a great outreach opportunity we see in doing this. Yes?
Ham radio in the blind has a long tradition of adapting operating techniques to the blind.
Yeah, meter movement is a variable pitch tone.
Oh, yeah.
We've all built those devices for our blind friends. They're tuned.
So, not to run too much overtime here, but everybody here has heard meteor reflection sounds. You've all, I'm sure you've all heard just the H1 hiss and things like that. So if anybody wants to hear that, I have all those on recording here. But I mentioned Dr. Terenzi, the cross between Sagan and Madonna. She's done something truly unique. She got started doing this sort of the way some of the Radio Joe people have done, either by speeding up or greatly slowing down the audio they have recorded. And by greatly slowing it down, we're able to tell a whole lot more about the waveforms that are coming in, things that sound like pops and static, really are very, very complex sounds. Well, she did that, and I've got a couple of examples of her listening to, one was a radio galaxy, and another, I think, was some other object. I've got the J number for it here. But then, she said, what happens if I take that audio and run it through a Moog synthesizer? So everybody here knows what a Moog synthesizer is. But what she's doing is creating music from the signal levels and frequency changes coming from the radio signal. But the end result not only becomes very marketable as nice music, but blind students can perceive real science out of these signals. It's not just nonsensical, but they can detect signal level changes, frequency changes, all kinds of things that we would be using chart recorders or the waterfall to look at. So let me share a couple of them with you. This one is UGC 6697. Sounds like science fiction movie, but this is actual audio recording. This has not been processed a lot. You know, obviously it's like false color images. She's transposed frequency ranges so it becomes hearable. But this, at least according to her release on this is not pieced together. This is a continuous recording session. She has greatly slowed down the audio. I think she said around 500 times reduction in speed on the audio. What that would have actually sounded like is just like our H1 hisses, apparently. To the ear, before it gets processed, there'd be no meaningful information there. So the blind folks we've shared this with want to hear this over and over and over, and they make a lot of mental notes about things that are very different about it. So one other, and then I'll be done here, is, let's see, which one is this? This is J0437, and this is where she used the Moog synthesizer. No, it was wrong on that.
Welcome to another ABC Radio National podcast.
No. Believe me, I won't really waste your time, but if you will, if you're interested in this, Google her. Her name is properly spelled in paper but it's Terenzi. And on her Wikipedia entry, she's got maybe 25 or 30 links to her MOOC synthesizer translation of the radio signals. So please get a hold of me anytime if you've got suggestions, or if there's anything we can do to help your programs. But I just feel this is an area that we're being called to serve these folks. So thanks, folks.
Next, we have another member from Colorado, something, I think it's in the water. Got Rich here, he's going to talk about navigating through space with nothing. Or is it something?
He's navigating through space with nothing. Does that mean he's taking you back to newer with him?
No, yeah, he is.
Yeah. While Rich is getting set up, one more thing I wanted to mention. At the Western Conference, we had 2 blind attendees. One was totally blind, and he had a service dog with him. Afterwards, I asked him, how did it go? And he said there were 3 presentations that I think I really followed completely. The others I was kind of bewildered by. One that he completely followed was Rich's presentation. So it's, I guess, a lesson for everybody who presents. If you can enrich the words you're using when you're describing things and try to keep in mind not everybody can visualize what's up on the screen, you can be really successful.
What did I do to make that happen? I need some feedback on that.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the, remember we're trying to get ready for pulsars, and we're just getting our pulsar systems and our software set up. So this was my second attempt to learn pulsar stuff, and being like, using my navigation my navigation background, people were talking about how do you navigate with pulsars. Now, the classical method I have seen is using like timing, and you have to have very sophisticated timing data to do pulsar navigation, which, timing arrays and things like that, which was really too hard to visualize how to do it. So I came up with a way, I haven't seen it done anywhere like this before, but I came up with a way to just take the pulsar period, the distance from the pulsar, and the spin down rate, to come up with a way to do a three equation, 3 unknown problem that comes up with the position you are in a galaxy based on the pulsar, or what you're seeing. So it works, and it gives pretty good accuracy. I mean, you talk about 0.02 light years is good accuracy, but hey, you can find you can find the solar system that way, and then after that you're on your own. So I want to throw this in. Now, I got a lot of tables in here and stuff like that, and I apologize. I recommend you look at the actual file that has the color in it, so the color didn't show up much. So I have a lot of these things where I've identified that you can actually see the pulsar, and I'll explain here that just because Carl Sagan put those pulsars on there doesn't mean that somebody in another part of the galaxy actually can see them or knows they exist, because there's a very narrow beam that happens to be hitting Earth for those pulsars, but everybody else may not be in that beam, so they didn't know the pulsar exists. And that's one of the key things on finding the pulsar. Get through this here. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about is the first, what is the sort of the geometry of a pulsar? How does the beam pattern work? How does it look like a lighthouse in the sky? How can you tell which pulsar is which? How do you know that you're in the beam? So if you are not on Earth, how do you tell if you're going to be in the beam? Okay. So I came up with a practical, really straightforward way to
put yourself anywhere in the galaxy, three-dimensional coordinates, and determine if you're in the beam of any one pulsar. And then we're going to do a hypothetical trip using this pulsar between 2 points in the galaxy, and I use the Super Earth K452b again. And I'm doing a trip between them and assuming those guys are coming to us, can they actually find our way there? And if we're going that direction, do we lose the pulsars on the way that we can see on Earth, but we may not be able to use all those pulsars in the other direction? Okay, so first is I'm going to determine the starting point and the destination. So I'm going to use the Super Earth and Earth, and then I'm going to go to we're going to figure out different points along the way where you have to jump out of warp drive to take your pulsar measurement. Do not take pulsar measurements when you're in warp, because that whole speed of light thing gets in the way, and you don't get a good pulse number. So I just want to make sure that that's, when you guys do the observations, jump out of warp first, get to 0, and do it. Okay. So
0 relative to what?
0 relative. Just stop as slow as you can so you don't have any relative speed. Compared to warp drive, it's anything's slow. Okay. Then at that point in the galaxy, wherever you're at, determine which pulsars are visible to you. Okay. Now, part of the pre-planning, and this is what I always did on the sub, I had to go sit there and put all the charts together for where we were going to go, pre-plan the waypoints, pre-plan all of the, if I was going to be on the surface, pre-plan the lighthouses that I was going to observe, how many lighthouses have a distinct rotation rate, just like pulsars. So on the chart, it'll say that, this thing flashes every twice a second or something like that, so you can tell there's a couple lighthouses, which one's which. So the same with pulsars, which one am I going to go look at when I stop at my 0 relative and jump out of warp at a certain position. And so I'm doing all the pre-flight navigations, and I'm going to pick pulsars along the way that I can actually see from that position. So I have to figure out a way to calculate that. Now during flight, as I'm saying, you have to stop, do that, and then I'm going to adjust course accordingly once I come up with my 3 equation, 3 unknown model where I'm at. Okay? It's sort of like a time machine. If you are a distance away from the pulsar in light years, that's how many years ago that spin down rate hasn't happened. So pulsars go from high speed spin to low speed spin. So in a year, you're looking a year back where it was a higher speed. Okay? So depending on where you were in the galaxy, you will see that pulsar period slower or faster than than another spot. So that, using that method, you can actually, if you get 3 pulsars, you can actually determine where you're at based on the period that you're observing from each pulsar. Okay, so a little bit about pulsars. Pulsars have, think of them as a round circle about 10 kilometers, not very big. They always say the size of Manhattan. It is spinning around a central axis, and then there's sort of a lighthouse beam here with a certain width, okay, and that lighthouse beam is spinning. Now that's all in a magnetic field, and there's something called a light cylinder right here to a certain point. So this whole beam can't shift this way. It's sort of redundant, it does shift that way, but fundamentally there's a limit where it can point that way depending on its speed, because the magnetic field starts going faster than the speed of light. It's spinning so fast. So there's only so much of a limit it'll come down. So it's somewhere in this range. There's also a beam pattern. So you can't see between here and here, and we can't see between here and here, but we can see if we're having to be in here. Now all the pulsars that we see happen to be hitting the Earth somewhere during their turns. That's key, because if you're somewhere else in the galaxy, you may not be in that beam, and you don't know that pulsar exists unless you see it as a neutron star. You will not see the characteristic rotation. And that is where I think the pulsar map they put together had a problem, is that those are the pulsars we could see, but out of the 14, you'll find that there's, I mean, I showed you that the last time, there's only 2 I can see from a little planet that's only 400 light years away. There's only 2 that were visible of that planet. All right, and that's not enough to navigate your way using this method. The ATNF database, and I got the links to that at the site. This has the complete list of about 2,070 something pulsars. It has, it actually has the link to where they got the data. So it's very well documented. So what it does do is it has the J name, this is the Julian date name, so this is the 2000 epoch. It has the galactic coordinates and the distance in kiloparsecs. And then it has the period, and then P1 is the spin down rate. So this is like 10 to the 5.967 times 10 to the minus 15th degrees per second, you know, spin down rate, or really seconds per second. So it'll spin down 1 second, that number of seconds every second. So those 2 numbers there are key, and the distance is key because this kiloparsecs, if you turn that into light years, you can, and then you convert the seconds into light years, and you get all that, you know, all those conversions done. You now have if you're 1 light year away from this thing, then you know what you're doing. Now the other issue is this is the period as seen by the Earth. This is not the period that is at the pulsar. So the pulsar is sitting here spinning, and we are 1.4 light years away. We are seeing it in the future. We're seeing it 1.4 years ago from the actual pulsar. So you have to come up with what's called a base period. I'm calling it the base period of the pulsar spin, where the pulsar is actually spinning at this rate. Everything out past that is being spun down depending on how far away it is and what you're seeing on that. And that's the key to the navigation problem.
Excuse me, before you go on?
Yeah.
Does the Julian number tell you when that spin down calculation begins?
No. No.
Okay. Do you have to know the date that
yeah, that is one of my error problems here, is that I don't know the exact date that number showed up, where they came up with that number. It doesn't tell you that, and that's a problem. So I'm using 0 day, you know, there, but that is an error issue. That could be 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And now you're 2 years off from
15
that,
years ago.
and that means your base number is off. So there's a lot of things here. This is sort of like, I'm coming up with a big picture here, but there's all sorts of room to tune this thing up. And that's where I think the students would have a blast doing this, because they can go in there and they can come up with, they can find the real numbers, and they can use the process, they can come up with very fine-tuned precision data using this method. Yeah, that's a good point. That was one of my errors. Now the VCR database, I recommend the ATNF only because it's more complete. This stuff has a number of databases, and and I try to compare the 2. And by the way, the distances in this database are different than the distances in the ATNF database, even though they're both, you know, have references on them. So I started just using the ATNF database as the primary one, independent of maybe it's the most accurate. So that's another error issue, is that the databases weren't agreeing on the bases. And you really do that to determine your base period, which is the key to this whole thing. All right, I made a little, it's a simple Excel program, and I made Earth. Earth's at 8,500, approximately 8,500 parsecs from the galactic center. This is an X, Y, Z. And so Z is up, Y is toward the galactic center, and X is you know, this direction, right? So Y, Z, right? So actually it's in the direction the Earth's moving around the galactic center is the X. So we're really 8,500 parsecs away from the galactic center in the Y direction, okay? Now, if I'm going to go to K452b, that is the galactic coordinates for that. So it's a little closer to the galactic center, it's a little, you know, the x-axis, and it's a little higher, and 74 parsecs up, okay? So you have to do the 3D equation there, because that all adds up to distances. So if I do my jump out of warp 3 times before I hit that thing, so I just said 25, 15, 75% between here and here, and this is the basic chart you come up with, and that actually we're going from Earth to there, so we're actually going up in the y-axis to get there. So basically that's that. The reason I did that is to be able to figure out what the coordinates are I would expect here. Okay. Now in my model, this 25%, I can actually enter 50%, 30%, whatever here. It'll automatically calculate, you know, those coordinates. So I can actually sit there and use that number, and that number drives all of the different tables along the way. So that I can change, when I change that thing, I can actually, all the numbers shift in all the follow-on tables to that percentage of distance. Okay, a little bit about the geometry. As I was saying, here's the rotation axis. Think of the pulsars right here. Rotation axis, there's a thing called the beam angle right here. So think of it as the beam is 2 times the beam angle is the width of the cone that is pointed at us. Okay? The magnetic inclination angle is the center of that cone to the rotation axis. Why is this important? Only and then there's an estimate I got out of one of Krauss's books, or actually out of one of the pulsar books, that this is approximately that to the period of the -1/2, okay, in seconds or per second. So why is that important? It's because we are here somewhere. The Earth is here in this beam, and if I needed to figure out if one of those coordinates for where we're going to be at is outside that beam. So the estimate I made is assume that the Earth is somewhere, that this beam angle, this 2 alpha beam angle is from here to here, and the Earth is somewhere in there as the starting point. So the Earth is, we know the Earth sees the beam, therefore within 2, if you're outside 2 alpha from the Earth, then you can't see the beam. Okay, and that's really, that's another assumption I made here, and I'm not even counting the other side of the beam. So what does that mean? Here's your 2 alpha beam angle here, and so if you're going to make and here's sort of the, in the galaxy, and here's your pulsar, in the galaxy, you need to be in this little semicircle, circle here in order to see that pulsar. So if you're going to make a path to Kepler 452, then you have to make a choice to sit there. If you're going to go a straight line, you got to go all the way through to hit that. All right. If you're going to use the same pulsars to do that, that one pulsar has to be all the way through there to see for the spacecraft to see the pulsar. Other than that, you may have to make some dog legs or things like that to stay in there. But I just did a straight path. And okay, a little math here. This took me a while to figure out, but fundamentally, there's pulsar distance. It's a triangle. It's a simple triangle. Pulsar to destination, Earth to destination. If they're known, then you have to figure out the base height, and you have to figure out a couple other things. Because I was trying to figure out what is this alpha angle here that I can determine that, based on the destination where I'm at, if I'm actually seeing anything. This is a little simpler picture. Here's your 2 alpha cone here, or I'm sorry, it's not alpha, that's phi. here's your destination. So as long as that pulsar, if you're in that beam, you're good. So I made the model so that if you're in the beam during the, you know, if you pick the destination anywhere along that path, you're green, but if you're not visible, you're outside the angle A there, then you're red. So it's very simple. I got, you know, about 700 of those pulsars in my model, and I simply put that, and they have to be on all three axes. All, you know, the XY, the XZ, and the YZ have to all see those, all have to be in those, all have to have the green in order to see the pulsar. Okay, really hard to read, but fundamentally this is the data from the database. I calculated the base period of the pulsar here. I converted the galactic coordinates. Now, I calculated the period of the navigation point. So I say with the 25%, I got galactic coordinates. So what is my expected observable period right there for those pulsars? So I calculated that automatically, calculated the angles there, and then I came up with, hey, can I actually see that pulsar, red or green, in the X, Y, X, Z, and the Y, Z axes? And he came up with these set of pulsars that all of those are visible at that. So now I've got my pulsar selected. Okay. Here's what they sort of look like when you get done. So I zoomed in more, and let's see. So the expected period here, that's sort of key, and obviously that you've got all greens there. So you can see it at all different angles. Okay, so what do all those pulsars look like? You know, this is the Earth. This is the K542b, so it's not very far away. And here's the XY coordinate system of the pulsar selected. You see, you probably couldn't visually determine that you could see those pulsars just looking at them. So you have to do some calculations to figure out if you're going to be in the beam. But all those guys are in the beam that we chose. So that's the key to selecting. Now realize I'm not making course adjustments or anything like that. I'm just going straight, so you have to choose that. Now, here's the key on the entire calculations are that your base period here equals your observed period times your P plus your P dot times the distance in light years you are from the pulsar. So the ET would have to have a good database where how far he is from the pulsar to come up with, quote, his base period for the pulsar. So that's the assumption here, is that we can figure out ours because we've observed it, we have an estimate how far we are from the pulsar. He would also have had to have a database so he knows his base period, the pulsar's base period. And he'd have to also see it. So we're assuming that if he's got this far and he's warping around, he's probably got that. And so if I wanted to go, how far is the pulsar distance from my observed position, then you just sort of do some math there. Now, if you put a trial X in there, so now I'm going to sit there and I'm going to guess my X, Y, and Z. You know, I stopped at 25%. Am I really there? My X, Y, Z coordinates. I'm going to, if I subtract that, I'll come up with a trial distance from the pulsars, at least 3 pulsars, and I'll be able to set up my 3 equation 3 unknown problem. And this, if you do an observed distance minus your trial distance, then you get an error, and the goal is using the solver program in Excel, try to make that error equal to 0, and you'll have you'll solve your three your equations. So in the model, you observe the pulsar at the space when you stop. Observe the pulsars at your new spacecraft position. You determine the distance from the pulsar using the base period and the observed period. You do multiple pulsar observations. So I'll show you need at least three 3 equations, 3 unknowns. More is almost better, except you add errors. And it's a 3-dimensional blanket position, so unless you're doing interdimensional, you should be fine. Okay, so hard to read, I'm sorry. Here is where the solver enters X, Y, Z as trials. So what a solver does in Excel is it will, I tell the solver I want to make that point right there 0. And every time I put a number in X, Y, Z here, it calculates a solution distance from the pulsar. And based on these numbers, in that what these should be, this is the real distance to the pulsar based on where it should be, where we think we are, and this is the trial distance to the pulsar, which gives me an error, and the solver, all I need to do, I'm trying to say, solver, make this thing here so all those errors go to 0. And then what that does is it gives me an X, Y, Z that gives me a position that all those pulsars agree on. And all those pulsars should agree that I'm at the same distance from them, and that X, Y, Z then comes out. So it wasn't too hard, but one of the key things, if you're going to do this at home, this is the setup I did. If I didn't put that integer right here on Excel, that was key, and those numbers there, it wasn't coming out right. It was, the solver wasn't working. So that, with a lot of iteration, I got my solver working. So if you try that at home, that'll save you some time. Okay, so what do we get? If I do 1 pulsar, here's my error in light years. 2 pulsars, 322 light years error, 426 light years error 2. I do 3 pulsars, 0.02 light years error. Okay? And then here's, I actually had 8 pulsars here, so after 8 pulsars, you don't get too much better, but I did have some kind of a glitch here at 4 light years, or 4 pulsars, but I think that's bad pulsar. But after that, you get a little better. So what does that mean? 3 equations, 3 unknowns, you minimum, that works. Now, the other errors here, this is the error in the solver problem. This isn't the other errors that you really have bad distances and things like that in your database. So realize that this is just, if you had perfect numbers, this is the error the solver gives you. But at least you've eliminated most of that. Okay, so what does that mean? Change all the light years around. Jupiter is that number of light years away. Pluto is that number of light years away. The edge of the solar system's that. And here's where my error is, right? But here's Alpha Centauri. So if I'm an ET trying to find the Earth, I at least can narrow it down to our solar system, right? That's the key. I mean, I can tell Alpha Centauri from us, I should be able to find the solar system, and after that, you have to do other navigation means. Pulsars won't be as good, unless you got real good data. All right, so now that I've got my model working, I'm going to go make the trip. So I'm going to start and stop destinations. I'm going to turn on location paths. I'm going to figure out my stop locations. I'm going to select all my pulsars along the path. I'm going to try to find the minimum, the number of pulsars and the type of pulsars that give me the minimum error, so I can get as close as I can to these things. And then, once I stop at any one of my stopping points, when I jump out of warp, I'm going to adjust course and speed to change, to get back on course. And then I'm going to, along the way, by the way, every time I'm there, I better be looking for new pulsars, because the key here is that most of my pulsars go away the farther I get from Earth. I better be, as I'm going out of the galaxy, I better get more pulsar data, because these pulsars are probably very confined to the Earth area, and the farther I better get a new list of pulsars so I can extend my way out to the galaxy. Because otherwise, the pulsars are meaningless after a while. All right. So I'm gonna plot the path, galactic coordinates, etc., and then I'm gonna get underway. That's Navy term, we're getting underway. Okay. All right, so the nice thing about my little tool here is that I can actually calculate, if I put in a percent here, I can actually put X, Y, Z in here, make myself quote off course, and it'll come out, calculate the observed periods at my off course position. So I did that to make myself, to find the periods of the pulsars, the observations at the 25% point that were really not in the exact straight line, so that I put those numbers in, assuming that that's the, if I was off course, this was a set of real numbers that I could put in there to test the model. So here again, we're going this way, the X, Y, Z plane. All right, I selected a set of pulsars. Notice they're all green all along the way. So I've selected a set that I should be able to see a series of pulsars. Now there are more pulsars you can see between those 2 points. These are just, I figured 8 was enough of what I built my model on.
Are those all the same 8?
Those are the same 8, yeah. Well, let's just do it.
As you travel, you're going to have to add new pulsars as you find them to the map.
That's exactly
right. A
right.
growing database, just like
right.
navigational charts were in the 1800s.
If I chose a position farther off, like I was, you skipped 40 Eridani, because we always team with skip on SETI stuff. I would have half those number of pulsars that were even visible, halfway to 40 Eridani. All right, so that's key. We're going to have to go.
So you're going to lose some of your pulsars and gain new ones, and you have to kind of calibrate the new ones because they're going to become your navigation things. You lose all of the old ones.
That's right. What's dispersion measure when I'm 10 light years from Earth and I'm looking at a different angle? The dispersion measure to any pulsar is different now, and so that gives me a different distance. Right? That's how you figure out distance on those. So there's all sorts of issues with. If you're not at Earth and you try to detect a pulsar 10 light years from Earth, and you're looking at the pulsar from a different angle, you're looking through a different ISM cloud, interstellar medium cloud. And that's how they figure out pulsar distance. So there's all sorts of issues with new pulsars not being observed from Earth.
Well, by the time we get the propulsion system to do this, we'll hopefully have a computer.
The navigators be ready for you propulsion guys to get your act together, and we'll be ready to go travel, okay? That's all I'm going to say.
Bezos will hire you right away.
That's right. As long as Bezos gets his act together, gets the propulsion system going, I will help him navigate. All right. So, just from a nuke, right? I can say that.
That's right.
All right. So, okay. So here's the pulsar names, the J names, and then here's the recorded period. So this is when I said the model. When you stop at the 25% point in the path, and you will observe a series of periods from these pulsars. Now my model was, I was able to put an offset there, just X, Y, Z coordinates. It was not on the path because I was simulating that we were off course. That is the actual numbers you come up with. This model goes backwards too. It'll actually calculate the periods anywhere in the galaxy depending on where you're at. So this is what the observed periods would show up at. And that's what you get. You take the observation when you come out of warp. This is why you don't want to be in warp. The Doppler effect would screw this all up. Right? Twice the speed of light, Doppler, I mean, I'm not sure what the numbers would be. All right, so you take those numbers, you put that into recorded periods here in my model, and you run the model, and you come up with, here's the error, that's the lowest error I came up with. And you come up with, there's your position, X, Y, Z coordinates. That's where you're at. Based on that observed model, this is where you were at that meets the criteria of all 8 pulsars. And what does that mean? You're here, but what you want? You wanted to be here, but you're here. All right, so now you've effectively calculated your position in the galaxy, and you found out you were in the wrong spot. All right, that's a little distance off. I mean, I had to make it big because just, if you're anywhere on the edge of those lines, you're, almost light year off, so that's really bad. But I had to make it a little bigger just for graphical purposes. Anyway, so you're there, so you're gonna have to make a course change in order to make that 50%, or you're gonna decide to go, all the way straight down that direction, instead of just trying to make the next point. The captains hate this. If I remember like that, the captain hates that, and I usually get yelled at if I'm that far off. So, but here you have to make a 3-dimensional course change: the XY plane, YX plane, the YZ plane, and the YZ plane. You have to make coordinate changes. So you have to do a 3-dimensional course change there in order to get back on just to the 50% point. Okay, so what did we just do? Well, follow onward. Characterize the beam in the model. So that beam is an approximate beam, all right, and it's based on the Earth being in that beam as the starting point, all right? We don't know where we're in that beam. We're on the edge of the beam, and people can be, we may actually, a bunch of stars, or people on this side of the beam can actually see it, and we can't see anything interior to the beam. We don't know. We just know, I just made the assumption that I'm in that beam, and what's the worst case on both sides that I can see something. So that beam needs to be characterized. The pulse down spin models, there are a thing called glitches. There's all sorts of, not earthquakes, but neutron star quakes, where it actually slows the pulsar down real quick and then speeds it up. And then eventually it narrows down to the standard spin down rate. But those things, you have to characterize those pulsars to, because over the years that spin down rate may not be consistent. So you have to have a good history on spin down rates. Pulse out range errors. As I'm saying, the databases had, one has 8 kiloparsecs, one has 0.5 kiloparsecs on the same pulsar. So the range errors on the databases are huge. Right? So I use the AT&F one as the baseline, but they're all over the place. So and dispersion measure doesn't give you great numbers. There's some the guys can do some parallax on some of the closer pulsars, and those they're using as the baseline. They're comparing that with the dispersion measure version of that. So we have to do a very good detailed pulsar range things. The solver wouldn't let me get down any more decimal points. So I wanted to get below 0.02 light years error. I'd have to get a better solver that does more numbers in the back. It started bombing if I started adding more precision. So, MATLAB might do that, or some other kind of thing might do that. The Gaia astronomical catalog is supposed to have a lot better detail numbers of where all these positions are in the galaxy. So we might want to shift to Gaia. They got pulsars in there. Other things, the Doppler shift correction, if you actually got speed in the galaxy, how do you do that? How do you know where your Doppler is if you're just, sitting in the middle of the galaxy somewhere? Dispersion, I think I'll talk about all that. The effect of gravity on measuring time. You go to the center of the gravity, or the center of the galaxy, in a stronger gravity field, therefore space-time curvature is going to be different, and you may not have the same time constant. So your time is measuring time at a different speed, depending on where you're at, and therefore these periods don't work. Yes, sir?
Do you have to worry about even the Earth's gravitational well, relativistic terms?
Right, so if all these periods are measured from the Earth, and you're in a spacecraft not on the Earth, is your time constant the same? You're measuring what you're going fast.
I thought you might.
Yeah, a second is not the same second. All right, so that, yes, you're going to have to calculate that. And I guess the nice thing about growing up in the galaxy is that farther away you get, you'll hit those things incrementally instead of hit a major chunk where you're expecting 25% between here and people who are 5 feet deep or whatever. Okay, so summary, we've came up with a viable option to use pulsars for navigation. location, in FTL flight, faster than light, okay? We need to, you need precise measurements of pulsar period spin downs. So what are we doing when we're detecting pulsars? We're getting the pulsar period, and we measure that twice, once every year, you can get the spin down rate. So we can do that as amateurs. We can come up with the pulsar periods real quick, and we can actually detect the spin down rate. So we can actually provide the data for our galactic travel as an amateur pulsar guy. Calculating the distance from pulsars to the Earth, we can do that too. Now we can calculate dispersion measure, which can calculate the distance to the pulsar. We can do that as amateurs. Okay? Then we can compare that with we can calculate pulsar base period, so we can figure out what the pulsar is actually doing, as opposed to what we think it's doing from the Earth. And then we compare that with the ATNF database and prove the Aussies wrong.
Sorry, say again what you mean by the base period? Pulsar base period?
When we're observing a pulsar, we are seeing it as it was, say it's like 1 light year away, right? A year ago. If it's already spun down, we're seeing it spun down by 1 light year time, 1 year times the spin down rate, right? The base period I'm calling is, what is the pulsar at its location spinning at?
Right now.
Right now, at the pulsar. What is its real base period? You need that in order to be able to go anywhere around the galaxy and be able to recalculate what the observed period would be if you were somewhere else. That's what I'm calling it. Okay. Let's see. Now, what do we do as student exercises? I can sit there and use this model to observe. I get observations on any pulsars. I can actually put that in the model, and it'll come up with the XYZ coordinates of the Earth. Now, based on this. All right, so we can figure out where the Earth is in the galaxy, and then theoretically, as the Earth goes around the sun, I should see that change, the XYZ coordinates change to where the Earth coordinates are in the galaxy around the sun. So we should see the Earth going around the sun by measuring these 8 pulsars periodically over the year. That's a great student exercise. Now, how would I redesign Drake's and Sagan's pulsar map? I would sit there and I'd put observed period and base period on the map, and that way they can say, okay, this is the observed, this is what they think the base period of the pulsars are, here's what the observed period is. They can actually do the 3 equations, 3 unknowns, and come up with a lot more precise position of the Earth than the angles and distances graphically presented. So I think we can come up with a lot better pulsar map using this method. Okay, and Deep Space Exploration Society, Dayton Jones and Ralph Boyd. By the way, those 2 guys, Dayton Jones and another PhD, the ones that told me you better don't cover up the people in the pulsar map. People are more mature than that. I'm like, I'm sorry. And Jeff Lichtman and Steve Block, from Marine Astronomy Supply, those guys always review my stuff. All right. And this is the guy that I said that came on our property and made him a member as long as he became the photographer for the club. That's the guy. That's another one of his pictures. So, all right, that's all I got. Yeah, thanks.
Outside the purview of your study, but for the physicist, astronomer, or whatever, what is the minimum set of equipment necessary to perform this?
You need a way to detect the pulsar at whatever base, probably 400 megahertz, some kind of a, wait, to perform my calculation?
No.
To perform the pulsar measurements?
To form the input data for your calculation.
Okay, you
What-
just,
In other words, what equipment do you, what's your navigational equipment on the spacecraft?
well,
Yeah.
the 20-meter telescope here
Yeah.
does pulsar measurements. It calculates the period, all right? It calculates the dispersion measure. From the dispersion measure, you can calculate the distance, all right? If you don't want to use a database, you just want to do raw data and come up with these numbers. Now, to calculate the spin down rate, what they normally do is wait 6 months, and they take periodic measurements of the period, and they come up with that 10 to the minus 15.
Not to calculate the bowage, but you're sitting out there with your sextant. What does your sextant need to look like to do this?
I don't need a sextant. I'm doing time. I'm doing zero range
I'm a
times the
metaphorical
GPS.
sextant for a piece of equipment.
The tool that replaces the sextant.
Oh, replacing a sextant? I just need
Telescope.
I need a radio telescope that can measure precisely multiple pulsars along my path and get a nice period. And if I already know the spin down rate,
And what is the
I
technical
automatically calculate.
specification of that radio telescope?
What's that?
What is the technical specification of that?
How big do I want my antenna? How big am I really counting on these pulsars?
Yeah.
I'll make my antenna bigger, right?
So
Otherwise,
you
I'll make
tell
it as small as I can to detect the pulsars along my path at the frequency that they're radiating at.
So you need to tell the propulsion guys that, how big that dish has to be, so
Oh,
they can put it
absolutely.
on your feet.
After they solve the FTL.
That's right. So yeah, I don't want them to go through an interstellar cloud and blow off my dish
Exactly.
because the wind load was too high, in interstellar medium, right? That's exactly, in FTL. FTL, I could get a wind load probably to blow off my dish, right? So, that's, life's little problems you're gonna have to solve with engineering, right?
FTL.
Yes, sir.
Did you estimate flight times, both for the people left home on Earth and the time?
The propulsion guys haven't given me a speed limit yet. They haven't told me how many
Say 90% of C.
Oh, I haven't done that yet. No.
Are you talking to the propulsion guys?
No, I'm not, because I can't. Let me tell you, I cannot do a high percentage of C. I either have to do faster than light or zero in order to do this method. Because if I'm at 50% C, I'm relativistically changing my measurements, and I can't do. And so, what do they want to do? They want to do pulsar navigation, or they want to go 0.9 C? I mean, make up your mind. Go faster than light, and I won't have to worry about it. Just stop, and you're at zero, and I'll take my measurements. I don't have to worry about all that mundane relativistic stuff.
You could estimate the flight time as measured by people back on Earth. And see how many human generations are involved at 5 per century.
That's true too. I'm also going to have a big Doppler. And I have to figure out the Doppler. Yes, sir?
So you have to temporarily surface to take as
I have to temporarily surface to take a fix, right? That's exactly the terminology I was waiting for. Yes, sir?
You mentioned that you may need to discover new pulsars.
You have to if you're going to get too far out.
And you have to have a much larger dish.
Very possible.
You have no idea about
we have to improve the pulsar detection capability in order to keep the pulsar database
larger.
Right.
Do you suspect this is a deployable dish? It would only come out when you stop?
That's all you need. That's all you need. I don't want to get blown off in the 3 times the
Just
yes,
like
sir.
the Enterprise.
Yes. Hey, go ahead.
How, it was remarkable you found 8 pulsars that you could see across your entire.
I thought it was, you've got 2,000 pulsars, I found 8, and those just happen to be.
How wide was the beam width?
What can I find? Their frequency, actually, I showed that formula. It's a relationship.
I didn't see numbers.
Well, I actually do have numbers. But anyway, they're in the chart. They're in the chart.
Just curious.
Yeah, you look on those Excel files. They have the 2-row number in degrees, and yeah, they're based on their relative to period to the square root of
Consider like this.
-2, yeah. Yes, sir.
So for IT to get to the Earth, after finding the Voyager spacecraft, I think this system, navigation system, will really help and make sense. But if I'm thinking about navigating a human spacecraft to a target,
which is what I did here. That was the human target,
yes,
right?
maybe I'm not sure about the practical purpose of this, but if you think about navigating on the ocean, you don't see the target, you don't see the city that you're going to, so you need navigation. But in space, you know where you're going to, you know, at the end of your travel is a star. Or if it's a faint star, it is radiating something, radio or anything. So you keep your target.
Wait a minute, let's talk FTL flight here. Where is, when you aim visually at a target, where is it really? It's 10 light years away. Where is it really?
Well,
it's really over here somewhere in reality. So you have to actually fly this direction.
Yeah.
And as you get closer, it starts getting closer in actual location to you.
Yes, but you analyze that star before your trip. You know how fast it moves or where exactly.
That's another lecture, right?
So once you know that, then you just have to use some optometry or parallax and stuff like that. So you
as a submarine navigator, here's the #1 key on submarine navigator. If I was a surface navigator, I'd have GPS, I'd have stars, I'd have all that stuff. I'm a submarine navigator. I never have squat, right? I'm sitting there in the middle of the night and my area of uncertainty is growing. And the faster I go, it actually goes faster, right? So, and I can only be at certain edges of the chart before I get into trouble. So the officer of the deck calls me up in the middle of the night and says, hey, my area of uncertainty is bouncing off the edges where I'm allowed to be. You need to reduce the area of uncertainty. So I have to go and find whatever navigation aid I can to reduce that area. So I have to look at the bottom and I have to say, when did we cross the 100 fathom curve, the 200 fathom curve? What was the angle we saw with the fathometer? Did we see anything else that we could possibly detect submerged, right? That is exactly, so we have to do everything. I have to put a wire out, maybe to figure out Omega, Loran, things like that. So what I'm saying here is, remember I did hydrogen last year? How you do navigate with hydrogen? This is pulsars. Now, it'd be very easy to say just do stars. Stars, you always have stars. But you better have something else. You better have other stuff. So this is just the pulsar version of that. So you're right. I mean, I would obviously have stars. But, you're also going to want pulsars. I think this gives you a better range than the stars do. Because the stars are, you take that and you probably have errors based on distances and precessions and all sorts of stuff.
But the problem is when you get too far, that existing known pulsars are not available anymore. So now you go to find new pulsars.
Right, you have to find more pulsars.
You need to design a spacecraft that has a 20-meter or something dish that is, surveying all the sky.
That's where I bring you guys in the design process and find put the pulsar, SARA pulsar detector on my FTL flight vehicle. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just use a phase array on the front of the dish.
I even got my antenna guy that's going to hook that up. Yes, sir.
The antenna forms part of whatever the skin of the vehicle.
That's great. And then it gets 3D, so I can actually look all directions simultaneously, take my observations with simultaneous
measurements. It doubles communications.
We can design an FTL. If we get the propulsion guys. We also need some kind of shield too. Yes, sir. All right, we're done? Yes. All right, thanks, sir. Thank you. Faster than light.
You can get started.
So you say FTL drive, you say faster than light. Yeah, read a lot of science fiction.
A lot of people have asked.
You'll end up with 1,000.
What do we have at the conference next year?
First cousin married his second cousin.
Let me get my calendar.
Third cousin married.
And the
human brain will deteriorate from the accumulation.
Or you'll mutate into a super genius. You don't have to go downhill when you do this, it just means that you have a higher probability.
You're talking each.
You also bring a bunch of eggs along, so you.
We have, what we wanted to do quickly was, we have dates for next year. Whether we follow the same format of this year or last year, I mean, normally we would do what?
Well, it's looking like the 2nd of August, which is a Sunday, through the 5th, which is that Wednesday.
So we won't have the extra day.
Well, we'll have Wednesday, we usually end up Wednesday, whether we'll have Wednesday morning or Wednesday afternoon. Any comment on the Wednesday afternoon bother many people?
Yes, Dave.
Yeah, don't terminate too late on Wednesday afternoon, because then I can't catch a plane out of Lewisburg on late Wednesday afternoon, it's 5:30. It's at least an hour's drive to Lewisburg.
You want to call it?
Yeah.
So I would say probably.
Same with Charleston.
Do you want to eat here, leave at 1?
Yeah, that'd be about right.
Yes, that's
Okay.
That's fine. That's not a problem.
It works for me too.
Yes, when is cellophane? Because I know there's a couple of groups that want to be in cellophane, and I want to try that.
We'll look it up and let you know.
Yeah, somebody look up when cellophane is for 2020.
Okay. But that's tentative right now with Sue Ann. So that's the date she gave me, and we went back and forth. So still tentative, it's not confirmed, and I'll look up.
Say that again?
The 2nd to the 5th of August. And while we're pushing it way out, they have so many events in June and July that they like it better when we're not stepping on other people's toes.
My wife likes it better too.
So, and I don't want to push it any further in August because you start having a school problem.
Yes.
I would like to possibly have it the 2nd week, but she didn't have anything. The guys from York College had it. It's like, hey, you're getting real, but if you push it too much, kids in vacation problem.
John Senior, do you know the date for next year?
No.
And you know, actually, if this is an early in the week conference, Sunday to Wednesday, it'll never overlap cellophane.
Which is a Thursday to Sunday.
Yeah,
Oh,
so
that's-
actually, forget, don't.
Okay, so, because we'll be Sunday to Wednesday. So.
Yeah.
By the way, just, can I get a consensus? When I heard that they had funding for at least another 5 years, that we would try to be here during that time, if we can. Is there any, I didn't think.
5 years.
What's that?
Let's book up 5 years.
I'm sort of hinting at that myself, and probably in August early. I like, nothing against the star parties, but I like it when there's not a bunch of juveniles running all around. And that's why I've kind of enjoyed this being the beginning of August. I don't know if that impacts anybody in a negative way. But.
Talking to the cafeteria and the room staff, they love us. We take care of them. We don't trash the rooms. We don't eat and throw food everywhere, so they actually are very happy with us. So, I mean, we've made somebody happy.
What's that, Bruce?
We haven't had any food fights.
No food fights. And
Not yet. Turn it at 2:30.
By the way, we
We're
still
not done
thinking of getting a tip to the cafeteria.
We've taken care of that.
That's taken care of. We always take care of them that way because they take care of us. So, 2nd of August, it could, but that's where we'd like to be. Yes, John?
If we're using later dates for the conference in August, does that let us push the last date for submitting abstracts and materials?
Adrian, that would be.
Yes. I need to get better dates. It was too loosey-goosey this year.
Too early.
I'll have those on the website. A lot of that I was responsible for and fell through. So yes, I mean, it'd be like the other conferences X number of weeks before.
Yeah.
But that needs to be written down, and that was my responsibility.
I'm just thinking, if you cut it off before the college kids are done with exams, they're not going to be able to get their act together on time.
Got it.
I'd also like to make Mr. Memory's job a little easier next year, too. Because he's the gentleman that prints out the proceedings, and the sooner we can get it to him, the sooner he can get it to the printer, the sooner we can get it, and we don't have any issues. So I'd hope that, yeah.
And the sooner we can include it in the journal, and the sooner we include it on the website, and everybody knows just what's going to happen, and it makes life a lot easier all around.
Yes, it does, David. Yes, concur. Is that it?
That's it.
Okay. Without further ado,
Bob said he had some more material, and we got 30 minutes.
Material, I don't know what to say.
Well, just.
oh, you'll know what to say.
You'll say also. And for 30 minutes, it was like, get him back up here and listen to him, and then we can eat.
When's dinner, or lunch?
12:30.
Okay.
So I guess after the first presentation, I was invited back for another half hour, and I could go a lot of different directions, but I'm doing this for your benefit, so
Yes.
maybe I could get some direction on you know, if I don't know something about something, or I don't know much about a certain topic, I'll just say, I don't know, let's move on to another topic. So, anybody have any suggestions?
Talk about
dishes, what you would like to hear? What?
Dishes, feeds, side loads.
In other words, G to T, how to get there.
Dishes, feeds, that sort of
Or
thing.
how not to put your dish feed together.
Well, that is a kind of a specialized area, which is probably not applicable to here. I mean, I could talk about some things, but it's probably, I'd rather pass on that, go to more basic type concepts. So,
Absolute calibration of an antenna.
which
Absolute calibration of an antenna.
absolute calibration?
Yeah, get an absolute reading on antenna temperature, power or something like that. Or what's an approach to doing that?
What's a true A sub E for this antenna? That gets to be,
Well, sorry?
what's a true A sub E of this antenna, the
A sub E.
effective area?
Oh, the effective area. Okay, well,
Yeah,
well, your effective, you're talking about the effective aperture, right?
yeah. How about we go about measuring that? Any
Okay,
hints
well-
you could throw out?
Well, the effective aperture is going to be a function of the antenna as a whole, including the reflector. And what I would do is just, if you have get in a free space situation and put a signal generator out here at some distance r, and you're back to that fundamental equation. Right, so you have lambda over 4 pi r squared, what we were talking about the last time, where r is here, here's your frequency, and so the power received is equal to the power transmitted times this. So if this is an isotropic to isotropic case, then you have a gain of an antenna this way and a gain of this. So if you know this, and you know this, and you know the power, and this is your question mark here, then it's just a matter of gain of the receiver, gain of the transmitter. So you just by algebra modify the equation, and there you have it. Yep.
Talk about far field.
Pardon?
Oh,
it definitely has to be in the far field, yes.
Yeah, so tell them how to.
And as far away from it as possible in free space. So you want to have the first 2 or 3 Fresnel zones here between point A and point B in the clear. Yep.
Yeah, but for a dish, it's different. I mean.
Yeah, I mean, that's
The issue
a
is,
simple way to do it, and it would be very effective.
the issue is a simple statement in free space.
Yeah.
And this is why it's so difficult to measure gain on real antenna ranges.
Right, of course.
Because you don't have free space.
Well, if you
You have
had,
multipath.
well, yeah, if you don't have free space, then you have stuff in the near field, and that's going to distort what you're looking at. You do have free space if you go up. So if you have a ham radio tower, for example, and you can put it up 50 or 60 feet, your signal source, then basically you have free space to the top of that tower. I mean, that's absolutely right.
But the real method is Cat A or something of that ilk.
Well, you could do it that way too, yeah.
That's
So-
that's
so
the way
signal
it's done
source,
in the
right?
real world.
So I said a signal source here, I didn't say what it was, yes.
Your antenna there is not considered to be a perfectly isotropic antenna or a dipole?
What, this antenna here?
Yes.
No, this is an antenna with some, the question was how you determine the aperture of this antenna. An aperture is related to gain by lambda squared over 4 pi That's the aperture of an isotropic antenna. So this is the gain of an ISO. Same, so gain and aperture are linearly related to each other. So what you're looking for is a coefficient in front of this term which defines the gain and also the aperture. Okay, so the question was, I don't know what the gain is. I want to know, and the gain will not only affect the size of the antenna, but also the efficiency of the antenna, because gain is equal to directivity times efficiency. So you may have a pattern, like a 3 dB beam width of this thing, but it may be inefficient. There might be losses in that parabolic antenna. So that'll affect the gain. So gain is equal to directivity if the antenna is 100% efficient. Yep.
Can I have another question?
Yep.
So I go to stargazes and
My hearing's not.
I go frequently to stargazes and demonstrate radio astronomy.
Yep.
And the question is, what diameter should be a parabolic antenna? That's minimum size, so I can use to detect the strongest hydrogen signals in the galaxy.
Okay, well, if you know what the power of the strongest hydrogen signal is.
It's, let's say Cygnus A between 10 power 2 to 10 power 4 jets.
Okay, well, you can plug in the numbers. I can give you a mathematical way of doing it. And that has to do with not only antenna gain, but the sensitivity of the receiver and the noise figure of the receiver. And in communications, you have sensitivity of a receiver. And let me do this in communications term. This is in dBm, right? Is equal to, you have your minus 174 dBm is ambient black body at 20 degrees Celsius plus. So you start with this dBm here, and you add the necessary SNR for the proper detection of the signal, plus, let's see if I remember all the terms offhand, plus the bandwidth, plus the noise figure. I think that's all the terms. So, this is the necessary input to the receiver. So depending on what your receiver, the actual receiver detector looks like, this is what you have to present to the input of your receiver.
I can improve my receiver, so I can buy a more expensive one that I can carry with me.
Well, that's part of the trade-off, but
the problem is that parabolic antenna I cannot carry in Amsterdam, my car. So the size, the mechanical problem,
right,
is the most important factor.
Okay, but it's all relatively simple in terms of doing this in the sense. You got a shorter way to doing this?
Yeah, you got to know the G to T of what is required.
GDT.
G2T, gain to temperature, which is the magic number for an antenna.
Okay, well, in astronomy?
No, in everything.
Well, gain to temperature.
Gain to temperature and the known power of the source, and of course your range observation.
Well, if you have the known power of the source, okay, I think I might be doing the same thing here. Because you're talking about temperature, I'm talking about dBm, which are linearly related, so you can go from one to the other.
Now, let me just finish what I was starting to say. If you know the G to T, you know what the signal noise is for a given radio source. Therefore, working it backwards, if you know the signal,
the signal to noise
you calculate the G to T.
The gain
from the G to T, you can then calculate what size antenna you need, knowing the realistic needs.
Okay, another question?
Okay, reference antenna, if you're going to try to measure characteristics of a signal antenna.
I'm sorry?
If you're going to measure the characteristics of a signal antenna, you will need some kind of reference, distance between them. Is a horn antenna probably the best reference for that?
Well,
in
you have,
microwave region?
okay, it doesn't really matter. You want to make sure that you've got the polarity of the antennas matched from the source to, or take that into consideration in your calculation. But if you have, it doesn't really matter. So you have an EIRP, which is so from that you can calculate your watts per square meter at some distance. That's what you're interested in. You want to know the signal strength or the power flux at your antenna under test. Okay, so now you have that, and so you have this, and then you've got a certain aperture. So if you have an aperture, which you don't know, is equal to that will, so you have a meter squared for your aperture, you multiply that by watts over meter squared, and you get watts input to the antenna. And that's directly related to this. So it's a simple algebraic term in terms of figuring out what the power received is here. And of course, this is the aperture of the antenna. So if you calculate watts over here, and you know what the power flux is at the antenna, then you can calculate the meter squared, the aperture of the antenna under test. And that relates directly to gain by of an ISO, and then you've got a coefficient out here, which is the numerical, that'll be the numerical gain of the antenna. So that's what you're calculating here. Okay, so it's, you go back to the first principles of, it's basically your path loss between 2 points. And then you base it, it's all based on ISO to ISO, and then it's just coefficients. It's just simple coefficients of the numerical gain. Yep.
There are different practical designs of antennas, like parabolic, or horn, or dipole, or whatever different kinds of antennas. All these different kinds of antennas have particular characteristics that make the effective area very different from the actual area.
Oh, yes.
And that's the whole problem, is trying to figure out how to transform your actual area into an effective area so that you know what you're actually getting, because the rest of that area is really waste, even though you have to have it because that is worked into your design.
Correct, yes.
And so that's kind of what the chief problem is conceptually, is how to understand that conversion factor that you're doing. What it makes a parabolic antenna have a particular effective area based on what its actual area is in terms of how the parabolic antenna is designed.
Well, a dipole looks like this, right? So if you look at the cross-sectional area of the wire, it's very small, but the aperture is going to look something like this around the dipole. So you're correct in that aperture, there's several forms, there's several types of aperture. There's the effective aperture, which is the only one we're discussing. There's the scattering aperture, which defines how parasitic antennas work. And then there's the physical aperture. And what your question is, how do you relate those two? Okay, so this allows you, this type of a test that I just demonstrated here is actually defining this. And you don't really care what that is.
Except that you get to know what A sub P is, because that's what your actual antenna is.
Okay, well,
And then you have to figure out what your ACP is going to be.
Krauss and most authors define a physical aperture, and it's easy. Well, there's so-called aperture antennas, which is kind of a little bit of a misnomer, which includes a parabolic antenna or a corner reflector, et cetera, et cetera. So what you're most interested in with a parabolic antenna is you have a physical aperture. You measure the diameter of the dish, and you multiply that by, well, it's pi r squared is the physical aperture. So you have a physical aperture, and then you have an effective aperture, which is actually what the radio waves are seeing, how much energy you can capture from a receive standpoint. So this is, your effective aperture is equal to your physical aperture times efficiency.
By the way, let me give you a hint why this A sub E thing is so important. If you go to the basic definition of radio astronomy field strength units of Jansky's, the antenna effective aperture is a one number that is very hard to nail down in a home lab. The effective temperature of a source, power per unit bandwidth, you can get to that by directional coupler and a noise source, a bunch of other things, but that effective aperture of the antenna is a big thing that a lot of us are really missing and keeps us from making fully meaningful measurements. So that's why we're so hung up on this.
Yeah, well, it's, I understand, and I think from my standpoint, and I haven't dealt with specific problems like you have, but in terms of measuring the actual the effective aperture of an antenna, the best way is an empirical measurement. You measure it through a signal source. You can calculate, if you happen to know the efficiency and you happen to know this, then it's a simple calculation. But you don't know that. You know what this is, and you really don't care what that is. What, at the end of the day, you really want to know that.
Yes.
Okay, so that's what I was getting at before. And the way I would do it is to have a signal source over here, a very weak signal, a little transmitter with a known antenna.
That's the trick.
But the trick has been solved.
The known antenna.
Well, the source can be a dipole, and a dipole, you know what the gain is, which is 1.67 times isotropic. Yeah, you don't even need that. You don't even need the aperture here. So this is your, lambda squared. Let's put that in just for drill. So that's what a dipole is, and you know what the power is. You can measure the power on a power meter coming out of your little source there. So now you know the EIRP. Okay, so you know what the ERP is coming from that source. So at some range, you will know what the power flux is here. Okay, so the power flux is such and such here, and then you go into, you're looking for the gain of that antenna, so you simply measure the received power. And that's all you need to find that variable. You only have, you want to get all the variables down. Yep.
In the practical world, at microwaves, the source antenna inevitably is going to be a horn because you can very accurately determine what the gain of the horn is from its physical dimensions.
Well, you can, if that's the case.
If you're working at less than microwave frequencies, the standard answer is a so-called NBS standard gain dipole, which is well done.
Okay, so if you have a horn, then you know the gain.
But both of those methods
and you have a power
imply
here,
that
so
you've
you have
got
an
a clean
ERP.
range.
The point is to define an ERP. You can use any antenna you want, and if there's a better standard at some frequency or one that's better available, and you have a power, you have an ERP. That's what you want, and that's gain times the power of the output of the transmitter. Simple as that.
But there's a lot of uncertainties
Yeah,
involved.
if I can finish where I was going with that before you cut me off. The real problem, and which is the reason why you want to use a semi-gain antenna rather than simply a dipole as a source, are the multipath issues. However, the free space, no other multipath is the ideal situation. And until recently, it's been almost impossible to do. However, in the presence of quadcopters, one could now make a measurement from directly overhead with a minimum of multipath.
Well, you still have multipath and ground bounce in back of the telescope.
I said with a minimum. I didn't say with no.
Well, you still have ground bounce, and in fact, oftentimes your rejection may be better in this direction than it is in that direction. Depends on the characteristics of the antenna that you're talking about for multipath. Multipath is a necessary factor. It's a good point. You've got to consider it in your calculations. But if you go to a horizontal and if you get this up maybe, a relatively small dish, if you get that up maybe 10 or 20 feet, something like that, get it up in the air, maybe put it up on a tower, put this up on another tower or a mast, then your multipath, it becomes less and less depending upon what your characteristics are here. And you can actually measure that by moving this back and forth and finding a minimum response to multipath if you want to get and really dot I's and cross T's on your calculation. So there's ways, but yeah, unless you get up into free space, how do you do it? Well, so you have to consider multipath as well. I think that's your point.
And as a practical matter in semi-horizontal, and I'm talking including towers, getting rid of multipath enough to make the measurement meaningful is a very difficult process.
Well, again, what I do, without an anechoic chamber, which I use quite frequently, is to take, in free space, what you do is you attempt to measure multipath, and you do that, or the response of the antenna, and then make sure that the multipath path, or the likely multipath path, which is usually a ground bounce if you're doing a horizontal measurement. If you're doing a vertical measurement, it's going to be ground bounce from that angle. So what is the angle of this? So if you can measure the directivity of this, if you can measure this in a fully steerable antenna. It is possible to do that and correlate it. You're not going to get precise if you're close to the ground, but you can get close. You can get pretty close to it. Yes?
How would you design an efficient antenna for VLF?
For what?
Or VLF, like 25 kilohertz.
25 kilohertz?
Yes.
Well,
the magnetic antenna.
There's no such thing as gain.
There's no such thing as gain. You have to have gain in order for an antenna to work, although it may be infinitesimal.
Maybe negative.
No, it won't be negative. All right, well, that was one topic that is, when you talk about very low frequencies, you're talking about antennas which are very small relative to the wavelength. Okay? So there's something called radiation resistance. And for linear antennas, meaning dipoles, monopole antennas, etc., your radiation resistance is equal to something called the effective height squared times the impedance of free space times 4 times the aperture of the antenna. This is radiation resistance. I derived this from Krauss's equations. This factor is the average current over the maximum current along the antenna times the length of the antenna and wavelength. Okay, so let's say length in terms of wavelength.
Length in terms of wavelengths might be .001 or something.
Pardon?
At VLF, that length in terms of wavelengths might be .001 or some very small number.
Well, let's say at
antenna's
VLF,
small.
at very low frequency, let's say 100 kilohertz is what? That's 3,000 meters?
Yeah. So our loop is, let's say our loop antenna is 1 meter across, or our antenna is a 1 meter big structure.
Oh, yeah, well, you can,
What are the 3,000?
well, a quarter wavelength here would be what, 750 meters. It would be a quarter wavelength monopole.
No quarter wave whip in the backyard.
Yeah, no quarter wave below.
And he said magnetic, so big loop.
So what you're talking about are fractions of an ohm, small fractions of an ohm. And so your efficiency, or the efficiency of an antenna is equal to the radiation resistance over the radiation resistance plus the loss resistance.
So that's just the ohms in the wire.
Yes. Pardon?
That would be, the loss resistance would be like the
Well,
ohms in
this
the
is,
wire.
this
at
is
that
not only
frequency.
the wire, but it's also the ground losses.
Okay, so it's soggy dirt underneath.
It's your total loss of the antenna. So if you have a radiation, for example, if you're a ham, like a 80 meter or 75 meter 8-foot whip on the back, the radiation resistance will be less than an ohm, which means that your conductor resistance becomes considerable. That's why these guys put, 3-inch copper pipe for the first part of the vertical to beat that way down to well under an ohm. And but this is the total loss of the system. Now you can actually measure that if you have a quarter wave vertical. Now this is aside from the VLF, but if you have a quarter wave vertical and you measure the feed point impedance here at the bottom, and this is an electrical height of a quarter wave of what you're dealing with. If it were 100% efficient, you'd see 36 ohms. But typically you see some, maybe 42 ohms for the vertical. So now you know that the extra resistance here, and this is an empirical measurement you can make. You can also do it with field strength, but that's a lot more difficult. So here you have 6 ohms of loss. 32 ohms, because you know this a priori because of, what the impedance of. So 32 over, you got the efficiency. With VLF, this is going to be maybe 0.001 ohms. And this is going to be 0.001 ohms. And if this is 1 ohm, you can see the problem. So you're dealing with very small numbers, but it's the same equation. So that's the issue. So you've got to maintain a very, assuming that you're using a monopole antenna, you've got to get the resistance of the ground down, which means lots and lots of radios, and also a good low element resistance. Yeah.
Which is why VLF antennas either are E-field sensors or I-field sensors.
Yep.
And you essentially get around this issue by doing many turns so that you present at the terminal of the antenna at high impedance rather than one of these 0.1 or 0.001 volts.
Well, the feed point, well, actually the radiation resistance doesn't care what the loading inductor looks like. It's the same. It's defined by this, and that has nothing to do with the, because your current distribution, no matter what kind of load you use here, your current distribution is going to look linear. So it's going to be half of the maximum.
But that's a voltage sensing antenna.
Well, it can be any antenna. That doesn't matter. Now, if you do top loading and you get your current distribution down like that, then this goes up by a factor of 2 because the average current is now approaching 1 as opposed to 0.5. So you increase your radiation resistance by a factor of 4 if you can get a perfect top loading in a very short antenna. That's the advantage of top loading. Because this goes up this way. This stays the same, this stays the same, this stays the same. So that's what you can manipulate. So the RR stays the same. There's a lot of misunderstanding of radiation resistance and how to measure it. For example, a folded dipole, radiation resistance and the feed point impedance of the dipole in free space is about 73 ohms. Feed point of a folded dipole is about 300 ohms. The radiation resistance of a folded half-wave dipole is 73 ohms. So the feed point impedance is very different from the radiation resistance. So you got to be very careful with how you measure.
Now, could you call that loop in the folded dipole? Could you just say that's a transformer?
It is a form of a transformer. Another way of looking at it is that half of the current is in this wire and half of the current is in that wire. So that's why the current squared. So you're looking at the square of the current. So that's another way. But it is in effect a transformer as part of the antenna. Yeah. You could look at it that. Yeah.
What about in a terminated folded dipole? What does that do to change things?
RDMK.
Terminated folded dipole.
A terminated folded dipole?
Yes.
Well, you're assuming your transmission line here is 300 ohms, and you come down to a 300 ohm load.
Okay, now we've seen some use for Jupiter monitoring where you have a folded dipole and the top wire is cut and a resistor is put in there for the purpose of making bandwidth wider. That's going to have some effect on the efficiency, and that's, I think, is what might be what we're questioning there. What does that do to the efficiency?
The efficiency. Well, with a resistor, whenever you put a resistor in an antenna element, you're going to cut your efficiency back. Yeah, this thing's ringing. I don't know.
Those resistive antennas are a way to sell to folks who do not know what they're doing broadband.
Yeah. Well, that too, but you have...
They're a marketing thing.
Okay, let me give you another idea here. If you look at an antenna is a signal source, and that's what a receive antenna is. You can look at it as a voltage source in series with the radiation resistance. Okay? Now, if you put, here's your load, here's your transmission line here, and here's your load. So this is the receiver here. Okay? So it kind of looks like the classic conjugate match problem where you have, like in a battery, you have a voltage source and a source resistance and a load. So what happens here? What happens is that only half of the power that the antenna receives is actually delivered to the load. Now in a battery, we know that that resistance is simply heat dissipation. What happens in a dipole or an antenna?
It's also heat.
Pardon?
It's also heat.
Nope.
You radiate the energy.
It's re-radiated.
Thank you, Gary.
It's re-radiated. So what you have so here's the power, and it looks something like this. So this is the received power. When your load resistance is equal to the radiation resistance, that's the maximum possible power that you can receive. There's also something called a scattering aperture. So that, let's say this is your feed point impedance here. This is your load impedance. And when this is equal to the characteristic impedance of the, I'm sorry, this characteristic is power. This is power received, and this is power retransmitted. For the scattering aperture, it looks like this. Where this is a short circuit, if you take this and short circuit it, your re-radiated, your scattering aperture is equal to 4 times the aperture. So this goes down, so this goes out to infinity here in terms of your meeting an open circuit. So you go from open to short. In a short circuit, it's 4 times. So if you have a dipole in free space and it's shorted, it will receive, the power it receives, it will, the aperture of what it receives and reach, because there's no place to go for a load. So all it can do is re-radiate. And it's 4 times the aperture. That's why, let's say you have 2 dipoles in free space, and you feed them in phase. The most you can get is 3 dB improvement. Okay? With a Yagi antenna, because this is shorted, you have a dipole which is 3 dBi, and a really well-designed 2-element Yagi will give you about 8 dBi. I mean, I'm sorry, this is 2.15 dBi. So this ends up being in the vicinity of 7 dBi. So it's 5 dB more than that. That's why Yagis are so wonderful, because of the scattering aperture and because you can get 2 dB more.
So you're saying,
oh, by the way, you don't have to feed both elements.
So you're saying that a reflector or director is essentially a shorted dipole?
Yes. That's right. Well, a reflector is a little bit longer because as you go through resonance, the phase, well, first of all, the re-radiation is 180 degrees out of phase from what it receives. But then there's a slight phase difference, which is very significant as you go through resonance. So this actually, it becomes like a phased array. So it's re-radiating, but it's re-radiating at a phase that nulls in that direction and goes in that direction, if it's slightly longer. If the element is slightly shorter, then the phase is reversed and it goes in that direction. So that's how you build a parasitic array. It's basically a phased array, but you're playing with the scattering aperture of the element. So that's the difference between, that's why Yagis are so wonderful, because they take advantage of scattering aperture rather than just a 3 dB over phase dipoles. Yep.
I hate to be...
It's lunchtime.
You can continue, but some people may get up and eat.
Yeah, okay.
If you'd like Bob to continue, but for those who lunch is was served at...
It's either food or me, I know it's enough.
Quite honestly, I've eaten enough.
What time do we return?
Yes. 1:30, I think. Here. Got it. No, at least for me. No problem. Be able to balance this thing.
Did your email appear in the
That's what I'm asking, what time do we meet? And we go to right at 3 o'clock.
1:45 is Victor Seymour
on fast
That's
radio.
the best thing.
Now, are we recording this afternoon? Or do
You already found it out?
Well, where's the West Coast? Because that's easier for me, I'm in Washington State.
I'll put the links on the
It'll be at VLA.
last year.
Okay.
So we have,
1:45.
No, it's
It's a lot easier for me.
Airplanes fly down
a
here.
little over. Okay, so this,
I think I'm going to pack up and go.
No, I don't have,
Control room.
are you heading out now, after lunch?
I'm not even sure I'm going to stay for lunch. I've got a 6-hour drive.
So if you're heading out, have a safe trip and get to see you again.
You do my email.
I will see you next year.
W7SX.
As well as an email.
Yes.
Yes.
But that's automatically
As
forwarded.
I said previously.
There's only one, just one. The rest of them we're talking about in conferences.
So, yes, you think the peaks chain all the way to radiation in your key things?
Yes.
I have a small one of these. Okay, then I'll get my questions there.
Yeah, it's, well, you're talking about.
You said you wanted.
Because that's something that I've never introduced that, but